This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Good morning. It's 4 minutes after 10. I'd just like to begin with an apology. I should have checked this sooner. I haven't talked to you, I don't think, about pay rises for train drivers secured by the trade union ASLEF, and now the trade union RMT is seeking similar settlements for some of their members. But whenever I read these stories, I have two thoughts. The first is, why shouldn't train drivers earn a good scratch? Why shouldn't they earn a really good living? I think somewhere in the region of 70 grand a year, I read, which is not at all bad, is it? Why shouldn't they? There's a real snobbery attached to much of the coverage of industrial disputes or trade union action. Why on earth shouldn't train? Well, and the answer then would be because we can't afford it, which is the second thought, excuse me, that occurs to me when these stories break, which is I wonder what the money is like for the investors and the shareholders. Not necessarily directly in the railway companies, but the private firms that lease out trains for Britain's railway saw their profits treble in a year. This was reported in February of this year. They're the rolling stock companies, and they paid out £409.7 million to shareholders, while their profit margins rose to 41.6%. So the rest of the railways were being told to make swingeing cuts. Salaries, of course, were frozen. And taxpayer subsidies were still running at twice pre-pandemic levels, but the rolling stock companies paid out over 400 million quid to their shareholders. Now, listen, it's not a simple equation. You can't say, therefore, money should have been directed to the actual workers on the railways. But generally speaking, if I had to distill my politics down to a single principle, my economic politics, the politics of economics, down to a single principle, it would be a transfer of some money, probably quite a lot of money, from the people who profit from your work to the people doing the work. Now, I know that it is naive to think that you could run any form of economy without rewarding investment. But it's the scale of reward, isn't it, that's so interesting. There are graphs, there are fascinating studies into how much money has been redirected from research and development, never mind remuneration for the workforce. So to take those three things, you've got remuneration for the workforce. And yes, I did pronounce that correctly. And yes, I was well into my 40s before I realised that it was remuneration, the M before the N, rather than remuneration with the N before the M, because you're talking about numbers. You presume, I don't know how many. God, drop me a little note if you are learning that for the first time today, or maybe it was just me. It's remuneration. Oh, and by the way, there's no N in restaurateur. Did you know that? Did you know that? Restaurant with an N, restaurateur, no N. Did you know that? Did you? No, you see, that's why you tune in every day. These are the nuggets that I get for free. You get this stuff for free. It's quite extraordinary. Remuneration, restaurateur. What was I talking about? I'm joking. I know what I was talking about. So the three elements, if you like, of profit, the three areas into which money could go are remuneration, research and development, or dividends. And what has happened since Margaret Thatcher's premiership, really, is that the money that would once have gone into certainly research and development, and in many sectors remuneration, has instead been redirected into dividends. Probably the best example of this, and I'm hoping to speak to Feargul Sharkey later about his latest salvo in the war on the water companies. Probably the best example of this is the water companies. The eye-watering sums of money that have been sucked out of those companies could instead, or at least a significant proportion of that moolah, could have been invested in infrastructure. Again, it wouldn't be a perfect solution to all of the problems, but there would be a very strong case for saying if they'd spent a little bit more money on infrastructure, they wouldn't be pumping shocking amounts of sewage into our waterways on a daily basis. So there's a really perfect example of how straightforward this can be. The comparison of profits for the UK's private train leasing firms with the manufactured horror from right-wing journalists about train drivers earning 70 grand a year is a similar case in point. Although, again, I stress, I don't want to give you the impression that I am oversimplifying anything. Don't tell me you did know. There's no point getting in touch to go, oh, yes, actually, I did know that there was no N in restaurateur. Looking at you, Seamus. Anyway, don't even, whatever. I was today years old. That's a phrase I'm looking for. Dean in Brixton, the M before the N. You see, you live and learn, eh? You live and learn. And of course, the remuneration of the chief executives, the other graph, has increased exponentially. Again, if I had to distill my politics down to simple single principles, I would say that the highest paid person in the business will still be the highest paid person in the business, even after the gap between the highest paid person in the business and the lowest paid person in the business has shrunk somewhat. You will still be, I mean, even if you had a wealth tax, even if you started taxing assets, you would still be the richest people in the country. You just wouldn't be so much richer than people who can't afford to feed themselves. That's all. Anyway, look, I'm not a communist. I want to make that absolutely clear. I'm what you might call a compassionate capitalist, which I think is the only way to be. What is the average remuneration for a restaurateur? Asked Stuart, rather neatly knitting together today's semantic adventures. So I mention all of this because I work with younger people. I work with people who are mostly younger than me. And when I say the words trade union, they don't really know what I'm talking about. They have an idea of what a trade union is, but it has had no real impact on their life except as a news story, usually about railway workers going on strike and wanting pay rises. I don't remember what I was like at their age. I know that my dad always impressed upon me the importance of union membership. The National Union of Journalists, historically quite a strong union, and if you found yourself on the wrong end of mistreatment at work or unfair dismissal or poor practices, you could take a union rep with you into your meetings with HR. If you were made redundant, then the union might intervene to increase your settlement. Various ways in which you could draw upon the expertise of a trade union to which you pay your subs. But for younger people, the relationship is a bit different. I think it's a little bit more obtuse. Public sector representation by trade unions, I presume, massively outweighs private sector representation by trade unions. And I remember one of the penny drop moments as I made the sort of segue from being a showbiz journalist to being whatever it is that I am today. I used to do the programs where you go on the telly and argue with people until I lost the will to live at the prospect of who I was likely to be sitting next to next. So when I used to do those programs, and they're quite manufactured, I don't want to sound too cocky, but they're a bit rubbish. And you'd have people arguing about pensions that because the private sector pension scenario had deteriorated so badly, it was outrageous that people in the public sector still got good pensions. And I remember thinking, that's a bit like saying, I got mugged last night, so you should get mugged tonight. And then I thought, it can't be that simple. So I listened again to whatever Herbert from the Daily Mail or the News of the World it was that I was charged with arguing with. And I listened again and I said out loud, I said, but that sounds like you're saying that because you got mugged yesterday, you think everybody else should get mugged today. That's not equality. You're dragging down everybody to the lowest common denominator because that's where some private companies have led us. Is not a point of principle. It's a point of propaganda. And that was one of the moments for me where the importance of trade unions became clear. Just because the private sector has successfully squeezed them out of much space doesn't become an argument for the public sector not being able to have them either. It's an argument for trying to get them back into the private sector, isn't it? 13 minutes after 10 is the time. So today's headline, PM warned, empowering unions will stifle growth. And you think, well, we don't want growth stifled. Down with the unions and certainly down with empowering. So just let that settle in your mind. Empowering unions will stifle growth. Okay? Now try this on for size. Empowering workers will stifle growth. How does that work? Even yesterday, the conversation we were having about working from home recognise the fact that a happy workforce, a fulfilled workforce, a comfortable workforce will be a more productive workforce. Very post-Victorian tradition in this country to think that to make poorly paid people work harder, you should pay them less. But to make well-paid people work harder, you should pay them more. I'm going to cut your hours. I'm going to cut your wages because, you're not really pulling your weight. Oh, you've had a great year. Here's a bonus. Here's a dividend. Here's a golden handshake at the end of the year. Union proposals being drawn up by ministers will compel companies to recognise and negotiate with unions. And the front page of Rupert Murdoch's Times today tries to present that to workers as a bad thing. What's that you say? I'm going to have more rights in the workplace. Well, I'm not. That's outrageous. Down with that sort of thing. It's very much the same sort of politics that encourages people to vote against their own interests by, for example, becoming the first economy in the history of humanity to actually pass a referendum designed to impose economic sanctions on ourselves. So this idea that giving unions the right to access workplaces, to recruit and organise members, is a bad thing, is one that I would really like to examine. What is going on here? And what would you say to a 25-year-old about unions? I want to do a broad phone-in. I confessed to you yesterday, and I began to wish that I hadn't, because it's a bit like pulling back the curtain in The Wizard of Oz and showing you the daft old man pulling levers and pressing buttons when you thought it was the all-powerful wizard. But the vaguer my question, sometimes, the less satisfying your answers will be. So what's the point of unions? It sounds like a vague question in the first instance, but it isn't. Because I want you to answer that question from your personal experience. What have the unions ever done for you? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I don't, in the first instance, want you to ring up and tell me about James Callaghan in the 1970s. I am familiar with the winter of discontent. Priti Patel in the Daily Mail or one of the newspapers today reaches immediately for the lever mark cliche and does the thing that used to typify radio phone-ins for years. But I do need to recognise that things can go too far. You think of that classic Carry On film, or I do anyway, Carry On at Your Convenience, I think, where they try to get the people who are in charge of making toilet seats to spend an afternoon working on the systems, and the entire company grinds to a standstill because the union representative takes everybody out on strike. So things can definitely go too far. Of course they can. Just as they have gone too far in the opposite direction, where chief executives are trousering enormous sums of money as the average wage of the average worker plummets in real terms. Just as shareholders are drawing dividends out of companies that apparently can't afford to give their actual workforce a pay rise, which is the railways. So can we have a sensible conversation about trade unions that recognises two simple truths? The first being, the one that I just mentioned, things can go too far, and you need a bit of historical perspective to explain to a 30-year-old what the unions are, what they do, the good and the bad, and possibly even the ugly. But the other element of it is what they do for you, what trade unions do for you. I remember an advert from when I was about that age, from when I was in my 20s or my 30s, and I don't know if you remember it, but it featured ants. I think it was ants. And a single ant encountered an insuperable obstacle. The ant couldn't get over the obstacle. It couldn't move the obstacle. And then, I may be slightly misremembering the advert, but one of the many brilliant things about this job is that you will remember it and you will remind me of exactly what it was that happened. But of course, if the ant is moving in concert with thousands of other ants, they can move mountains. And that was the most perfect distillation of the trade union movement for me that I've ever encountered. And I can still think of it now. The very simple idea that there's strength in numbers. And the strength is used to improve the lot of the worker. And the employer hates it. Not all employers, but the kind of employer that Rupert Murdoch is, and that explains the editorial line of the Times. Rupert Murdoch hates it because he doesn't want his workers to have more power. He doesn't want them to have rights. He doesn't want them to be able to demand a limit on the number of hours that they work or a limit on the amount of days off that they're entitled to. He doesn't want workers to have rights, and trade unions give rights to workers, secure rights for workers. So what would you say? Two ways into this. The first being, what have the trade unions ever done for you? And there may be some negative answers to that, but I'm looking in the first instance for positives. 0345 6060 973. And then the second is a kind of analysis, if you like, of how this country has become a place. And again, you may need to provide the rest of us with a history lesson, where the consensus narrative in the British media is that unions are bad. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 19 minutes after 10.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Of course, teachers as well will be at the front of the queue of people who can perhaps tell us about the role that trade unions have played in your life. I don't remember this, and I was quite a fan of Bob Crow. He got the better of me on a number of occasions. In fact, I'm not sure I ever got the better of Bob Crow. I used to get so flustered dealing with Bob Crow, who the legendary leader of the RMT. So my politics were a little bit different when I started in this job. I used to get so flustered with him. I once accused him of calling a strike on New Year's Eve when he'd just announced a strike on January the 31st. And I said, but I literally said live on air, but that's New Year's Eve, Bob. That's a bit unkind, isn't it? What about all the people going to parties? And he went, I think you'll find that New Year's Eve is on December the 31st, James. Oh, yeah. Live on the radio as well. It's no dump button or anything like that. Just absolutely humiliated myself. But Claire remembers the late, great Bob Crow saying that if we all spit together, we can drown the gits. May not be the word that he used, gits. And that is a version of that advert that lots of you remember of an ant trying to get a bear out of the way. So one ant telling a bear to move out of a path, and obviously not having a great deal of success, but then turning up mob-handed and having enough heft and power to move mountains, or bears, in the case of that famous advert. Let's get the phone lines open. Enough of my burblings. Charlie's in Putney. Charlie, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, mate.
First of all, I'm currently reading How They Broke Britain, and it's fantastic.
Well, that's a lovely thing. Well, perfect opener. You can come again. Carry on, Charlie.
Well, I'm in a union.
Right.
I'm not sure what I can and can't say, so I don't want to say who I work for.
Okay.
But the point of the unions for me is, I mean, they don't just win me stuff that I didn't have before in terms of pay rises, right?
Sure.
They help me keep what I've got. So a big side of it that's not publicised is, they talk about, the media will talk about the unions asking for more this, for more that, but they don't talk about strikes that are just trying to prevent changes from happening, being imposed on us that would result in a worse work-life balance, a worse set of terms and conditions that we never agreed to in the first place. So, if you work for a private company, and it's the equivalent of saying to someone who works in an office, we now need you to work Saturdays as well.
Yes.
People that work in a private company have got no choice over that. They either
get another job. A few people are referencing yesterday's show when we were talking about working from home, but the backdrop of it was the idea some of us have that our boss is owners, and that we're lucky to have a job, and you'll jolly well do what you're told. And working out how you end up in that position is fascinating, but it does mean that if you don't like it, I'll find someone who does, and that's where a trade union protects you.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, it's a shame that a lot of people's first response, to me,
yes,
on a picket line would be, well, if you don't like it, get another job. And it's like you're sticking up for the people that would do away with you in an instant if it was cheaper for them.
We don't want to. Yes, I mean, there's a tension because there are some great bosses out there, and there are some workers who would welcome the chance to work on Saturdays. So I don't know why I'm keen today to really avoid making things too black and white. But the tension, the historical tension, to sort of get all Marxist for a minute, the historical tension between the owning classes and the working classes is the only context in which you can understand the role of trade unions, because trade unions provide collective power to the workers. Otherwise, the owners can do whatever they want. And some owners will be great and they'll be marvellous and you'll be happy to work for them, but they can still do whatever they want if you don't have union representation. And as long as owners exist who are exploitative and who are greedy and who are unkind, as long as they exist, then no matter how many brilliant bosses there are in the world, you need trade unions.
Absolutely.
How old are you?
I'm 35.
And among your peer group, age-wise, and obviously direct colleagues that you work alongside probably don't count, but I'm interested in what the generational attitude to trade unions is. What would it be for your generation, if that's a question you can answer?
I think they are largely for it.
Yeah.
I have one particular friend who always texts me whenever there's a dispute on, saying that he's completely on board and he supports it, even if it means him, not so much now, but pre-COVID and pre-working from home, even if it meant him getting to work late or having trouble getting to work.
Sure.
He was able to sort of see past that and see the bigger picture. I think there is generally more support for what the Conservatives, Labour and Socialists, but what we would Labour.
Just the simple idea, the phone line's going a bit south, of you having heft at work, a bit of heft, a bit of power, a bit of pushback. And the power, the beauty of right-wing politics over the last 30 years is to persuade people who haven't got power to get cross with the people who have managed to hang on to some, whether the union is the railways or the teachers or wherever it may be, that collective bargaining still has power. Here's a little game for you. I didn't tweet this at the time. I may have been on holiday, but I must have just got back from holiday. It was a high pay day, the High Pay Centre, which is an excellent, independent, non-partisan think tank looking at the causes and consequences of economic inequality, announces every year the day upon which the CEO's earnings have overtaken the median UK full-time salary. It's normally the first or second week in January that the average CEO's income overtakes the annual income of the average worker. But they also put out the CEO pay report looking at the multiple between the typical worker and the typical CEO. So I wonder if you want to have a guess. What number would you insert? Not Charlie, you. What number would you insert into this sentence? The average pay of a CEO on the FTSE 100 is now blank times the annual pay of a typical UK worker. What figure would you put in there? What would you like that to be? I'm quite happy for the CEO to earn 20, maybe 50 times. What do you think the actual figure is? The difference, the multiple that you use to multiply the average worker's income to get to the average CEOs. Have a think about that. I'll tell you after the news. Oh, and it's at the time already. We may stay with this for longer than an hour. It's a fascinating conversation and a really important one. And Charlie, 35, generational attitude to trade unions, broadly positive. Me, nearly 20 years older, generational attitude to trade unions, I think probably 50-50. 10 years older than me, probably broadly negative because of the memories of the 1970s. I could be completely wrong, but we will find out by opening the phone lines. It's coming up to 10:30. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Don't forget, you can text me on 84850 or even WhatsApp me on 0345 60 60 973. Quite a few of you pointing out the trade unions got Brexit wrong. Well, many of the trade unions got Brexit wrong. It is, in fact, a conversation I've had with Mick Lynch, and I don't think he, unlike his predecessor Bob Crow, I don't think he did get the better of me on that one. But so what? Nobody's perfect. The trade unions got Brexit wrong for the right reasons, if you like. It doesn't really have much bearing on whether they are a force for good or a force for bad. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:32 is the time. What did the Romans ever do for you? 0345 6060 973. No, it's the trade unions, not the Romans. But the point stands, doesn't it, if you're familiar with that sketch. Nigel's in Nottingham. Nigel, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, the Romans built more straight roads for starters, but we'll get back on to what the union did for me. I was a union rep and for quite a while, for over 20 years. And do you remember when they changed the pension, the way it was funded from the minimum funding to the actual funding requirement?
No.
Well, to change the way pensions was funded.
Right. And
that's why a lot of them went into the PPF. So when this happened, we had a an outside agency come in and tell us all what they would do, how good their pension would be, but they didn't tell us about the Section 32, which is a guaranteed minimum pension.
Right.
So people transferred into this pension, and when we found out there was no guarantee, we then went to the union solicitors, which you're entitled to. That's what you get for a union.
Yes.
You get your solicitors. We won £4.5 million.
Compensation shared out among the workforce.
Yeah, £50,000 roughly.
What would have happened without the union?
You would have had to pay for it. You'd most likely gone down that route, but you'd most likely have to fund your time in court yourself. It took about 3 years. There was times I was in Russell Square at TUCF. They was looking after us, and the union to me is a great experience.
What sector were you in? Do you mind me asking?
Print.
In the print. And how old are you, Nigel?
I am 62.
Right, that's perfect then. So exactly 10 years older than me. What would you say the attitude, your generation, in many ways is the most interesting, because it is on your watch, if you like, that the public perception of trade unions has moved from largely positive to largely negative, I would suggest.
Yeah, I understand that, but I mean, I think what it is, you need to speak to people. Because we get new employees coming in, and I'd say, do you want to join the union? So, no, what would the union do for me?
Yes.
And I'd say, you're not on the rate you're on because they want to pay you it. It's because the union have fought for it and got you it.
Everything you have as an ordinary worker has been fought for.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Do you want to have a guess at that figure? Do you want to have a guess at what the average multiple is for an ordinary worker? What you have to times that income by to get to the average CEO, FTSE 100 CEO?
I think, I've heard it before. I can't remember it, but I think it's quite high.
You're not going to win with that answer, Nigel. I think it's quite high. I've quite a few people guessing. Very, very few getting close to it. In fact, somebody's saying I was going to suggest it was 50, and that was really high. But you just said that you could live with that, James. So it must be much higher than that, and it is much higher than 50 times. There's a certain naivety to these kind of numbers, obviously. Rupert's not happy, for example. I can tell you've never been an employer. It's not all roses. We compete in a global village, not just the UK, and remaining competitive is incredibly difficult. I'm very happy for any of my 500 plus staff to try being CEO for a day. I'd give them at most a week or a month before they return to the security of that weekly, monthly pay packet. Many employers, including me, put our homes and families on the line. Massive risks. How do you put your family on the line? What the hell business are you in? Sounds like the Hunger Games. We love our staff, but it's hard to imagine the toll and stress that business owners endure sometimes. It's harder to imagine what it's like not being able to feed your kids because your income is so low. But everyone just take a moment to feel sorry for Rupert, please. Thank you. 10:37 is the time. Catherine is in Worthing. Catherine, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello.
Hello.
This is my first experience of being a union member. And on a local level, the two reps I've got are absolutely fantastic, and they've been incredibly supportive with regards to workplace issues.
Right.
On a national level, the recent strikes and subsequent discussions and changes to conditions, a lot of what I hear from fellow colleagues are that they feel they've been sold down the river by the union.
When you say this is your first experience, how long has this experience been unfolding?
I've been with the current company for over 2 years.
Okay. The job of the local rep usually is to represent the national policy to the branch.
Yes.
So I don't quite I understand the disconnect.
No, neither do I.
So you're just reporting what people say. It's not what you've experienced, or you don't understand it any more than I do. What you're telling me.
No, it's basically, as I say, that a lot of the new terms and conditions and concessions that have had to be made. As I say, fellow colleagues are very unhappy, and they feel that we shouldn't have agreed to them. Right. In terms of a local level, a lot of the different offices are run very differently, and as a result of that, some of the actual sort of working conditions where I am, the local reps are really sort of stepping up and pushing back.
Yeah, but they only work generally within the parameters that have been set at national level, either as policy or balloted.
Yes, they do. But they're also not necessarily happy with some of the changes.
No.
So they're
are we letting the perfect be the enemy of the... I mean, you're being quite cryptic. Are we letting the perfect be the enemy of the good here, do you think, perhaps? Or not?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, I mean, for you personally, 2 years' experience, is it better to be in or out?
It's been actually better for me to be in, definitely.
Yeah. 10:39 is the time. At the risk of sounding pedantic, writes one of my lexicographer correspondents, at the risk of sounding pedantic or perhaps even pompous, I hardly think your listeners would be surprised or confused about the absence of an N in restaurateur. They are surely aware that both words derive from the verb restaurer, to restore, refresh, nourish or feed. Restaurant, therefore, is the adjective or present participle, hence the N. Restaurateur is the noun for someone who carries out the act. The first use, of course, was in Paris, when someone opened a place selling bouillon, reviving, refreshing broths, and therefore it was known as a restaurant. In the 17th century, I believe. You see the quality, the calibre of intellectual that we have listening to this programme? 10:40 is the time. Thank you, Catherine. Colette is in Wapping, which is a word redolent with trade union relevance. Colette, what would you like to say?
Well, you asked earlier, what would you say to a 25-year-old about union?
Yeah.
I'm 66. My dad was an honourable union member. He was in the GPO.
Right.
And it was power to the people. He was born in 1912 when he came over from Ireland and they was poverty-struck. They were starving. Came to Britain and they weren't no better off. His family used to line up at the docks waiting for a ticket for a day's work. And if you was a selective few, you'd get it. If not, you would be turned away. Yeah. It was for the unions that them people that were turned away started to get a day's work and then a week's work. And that helped keep their families on afloat. I'm not saying they lived a life of luxury, but they kept their head bobbing along. And I would say to any 25-year-old, without a union, you wouldn't be where you are today, freedom of speech. Because it was the unions that gave that to the little man. And it was only Thatcher come along and she crucified them and she blacklisted them. There's good and bad in everyone, admittedly, but she was the one that really started to put her foot down. I mean, I can't talk like you do with all the figures and all that. I'm just a layman. But I'm only doing it on my own.
You're doing brilliantly. I don't like that kind of talk, Colette. I don't know what you're apologising for. You've covered more ground than I've managed to this morning, and you've got a lot more personal experience of it. And you remind us once again that everything we have as workers, and a simple distinction between workers and owners, between you and me and Rupert, the simple distinction being that everything we have was won on our behalf. Was achieved on our behalf. Otherwise, you go back to the days where people didn't have a day off. You'd be in domestic servitude and you were lucky if you got 1 day off a year.
Yes.
Boxing Day, I think it was.
Yeah, absolutely.
Extraordinary.
And there was 3 tiers. There was rich, middle class and poor. And even if you worked, you was still poor. And now, yes, we've still got class distinction, and it's not perfect. It's 100% not perfect, and we're going backwards instead of forwards.
I was about to ask you that question. That's how good you are. You answered the question before I asked it. I think we're going backwards, and I think that part of the reason we have gone backwards is the successful seeding of the idea that unions are not our friend. Somehow.
Exactly.
You're a star.
I think kids need to be educated in schools to make their own minds up. They need to bring that in and to say, look, this is where it started. This is where we are now. This is where we can end up. And, and kids are very, very intelligent and they are clever enough to make their own minds up. But when they're being whitewashed with all these unions are bad, that look up, the doctors are striking this way. They're only striking because they can't afford to live. They wouldn't be on strike otherwise.
Well, I mean, they can afford to live, but
not to the style that they should be in the hours that they're doing,
and not what they signed up for when they became doctors. I mean, it's fairly straightforward. But to hear the voice that you represent in the UK media, if you don't read the Daily Mirror or the Guardian, you're never going to hear this argument.
No.
No.
And of course, a lot of the broadcasters follow where the... I'm just going to read you some of the messages that have come in while you were talking. I love Colette, says Dee. Such clear and sensible points. Roddy says this lady is brilliant. Colette, and then just a kiss. I love Colette, says Mr. P. So you've done all right this morning, Colette.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you to your listeners.
Well, exactly that. And you know, these are relatively straightforward points, but as Colette recognises, they may not be points that are reaching the ears of the average 25-year-old. Everything you've got was won. And there are employers, not all, by any stretch of the imagination, who would seek to take it away. Because every pound that they take out of your wage packet goes into their pocket, goes into the pocket of either the CEO, and I'll give you that number in a minute, or the dividends and the shareholders, which is why I think of railways and I think of water. I think mostly of water. The amount of profit that these water companies have made while the service they provide has deteriorated. Again, it's a simplistic point, and the infrastructure wouldn't necessarily have been immeasurably better if all of the money paid out in dividends had gone into investment in infrastructure. But the point stands in principle, doesn't it? What would you do if you were in charge of a water company? Put £50 million in the pockets of shareholders and £50 million in trying to stop sewage spills, or put £100 million in the pockets of shareholders? Which would you do? What would you choose? Yeah, exactly. It's 10:45.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:47, and while we're on the subject of words, what does Labour mean? Literally, what does the word Labour mean with a small L? Yeah, exactly. So when you see the word unions appear in a headline that is designed to dismay you or even perhaps disgust you, just swap the word for workers. And the intrinsic links between the labour movement and the trade union movement are a matter of historical record and pride. And yet the official Twitter account of the Conservative and Unionist, as opposed to Union Party, recently posted this. Over half of Labour's MPs took trade union money. Labour have given away billions in union pay deals. Labour plan to make it easier for unions to strike in future. So let's translate that, shall we, into honest English. Over half of Labour MPs are sponsored by workers' movements. And the sponsorship they receive is negligible. It wouldn't get you a PPE contract in a month of Sundays. You wouldn't be able to buy a yacht with the kind of money that trade unions donate to individual MPs. But let's call it a workers' rights movement. So over half of Labour MPs receive donations from workers' rights organisations. OK, who disapproves of that? Who's still booing? Point 2. Labour have given away billions in union pay deals. Labour have given pay rises to hundreds of thousands of public sector workers. Poorly paid in some cases, well paid in others. It doesn't matter. Pay rises for workers. Are you a worker? Yes. Are you for or against pay rises for workers? And the only way that works rhetorically is by persuading you to be opposed to pay rises for everybody else, but still in favour of them for you. And where do you think that leads? So are you still booing pay rises for workers? And then finally, Labour plans to make it easier for unions to strike in future. Let's translate that into honest English. Labour plans to make it easier for workers to have power. Are you in favour? Are you a worker? Yes, James. Are you in favour of workers having power? No, definitely not. Down with that sort of thing. I mean, we shouldn't have any power. You see how they do it? You see how easy it is? 10:49 is the time. I'll give you the number. I mean, some people may have known in advance, but almost everybody's going to be fairly shocked by this, judging by the answers that you gave, especially people who said things like, it's probably 30 times more, James, but given that you're making such a big deal out of it, I'm going to say 60. The median FTSE 100 CEO pay is 120 times the annual pay of a typical UK worker. 120 times. And what would happen to these companies if a law was passed that said you can't earn more than 100 times the average UK income? Would they all go bust? Would they all emigrate, all of these chief execs? What would happen if you brought it down to 80 times? You can't pay your CEO more than 80 times the annual pay of a typical worker. What would happen? Armed revolution in the streets? Or the CEOs marching on Downing Street? What would happen if you brought it down to 50 times? The average CEO's income cannot, or not even average, your CEO's income cannot be more than 50 times the average income, the average annual pay of a typical British worker. What would happen? You see why unions are important? Of course you do. Bonetta is in Lewis. Bonetta, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Hello. Good to talk to you. I'm off the back of really of what you were saying. I think the mistake that we all make is to divide the workers away from the industries that they work in as if they're enemies of that industry. So my background is as an activist and a union member and so on, but now retired from working in unscripted television. So I was a documentary filmmaker for many years. But I'm now sort of trying to support people coming into the industry and understanding really that they're joining an industry where there's no security for employment, where they are workers, they're not employed, they're contractors, they're often working just a few weeks here and there. But what most people don't know is that last 18 months or so, something like 70 to 80% of most freelancers in TV have not been working at all.
Yes,
it's all gone to pot. It was publicised a couple of weeks ago in a brilliant piece, I think in the Observer, but in the Guardian Observer, documenting the suicide of one man who just couldn't cope any longer, wasn't well, was his illness was made considerably worse by the conditions he was expected to work in. But the conditions he was expected to work in were common to most freelancers. Looked at that and thought, yeah, I recognise all of that. And my observation would be that actually what's happening at the moment is that something like 46% of the current workforce is trying to leave, is looking for other work, is trying to move out of
people think of the media, don't they, as glamorous and quite a gilded existence. You're referring, and I normally try to put trigger warnings in when we're talking about suicide. That's all right, but I am now. I'm putting one in now. You're referring to the case of John Balson, and it was an extraordinary piece that was published in The Guardian, and the letters pages reflect that, and it speaks to the draining reality of insecurity. And you know, some people like to be freelance, some people choose to be freelance, but most of us would like the security of a regular pay packet. And trade union protection extends into these areas of life as well, not just train drivers and teachers. And it is it's a diminishing force, isn't it, in our country?
It's really important actually to recognise that organising for a trade union to organise in sectors like that, where you've got a very insecure workforce, is incredibly hard. You don't have any fixed teams. People aren't working together. So it's very atomised. And you have to look around for ways to join together. And the union can provide that. What's the best way? That platform's probably the best way for people to talk to one another and work collectively to make change. The other thing I'd say is that what most freelancers haven't really, I think, thought about enough is that actually the entire industry is incredibly insecure. So what we've also seen in the last 18 months is very well-known companies like RGF going bust because there is no work for them either. So you've got a hierarchy, sort of pyramid. So the only people who are really securely employed are the commissioners at the BBC, Netflix, wherever it is. Everybody else is in the same boat. And actually, what I hope is beginning to happen is that the independent sector, who make 90% of programs that you watch on TV are made by contractors, by freelancers who have no security
and don't know what they're doing next as they come to the end of their last contract. I mean, you're right. I'm so glad you were listening today to remind us of this element of it rather than the more obvious and traditional elements of trade union discussion. And staying with the media, I'm always struck by the people writing articles for newspapers about how awful unions are, who know, even as they write these articles, that when push comes to shove, it'll be their union that comes in to bat for them. This is actually extraordinary. And of course, as an extension of what Bonetta tells us, if you are the union rep on a national newspaper, then increasingly in recent years, you may mysteriously find yourself at the top of lists of staff earmarked for redundancy and the like. So you just need the power to push back, while acknowledging that sometimes people have historically pushed back too far. But you don't remove the power to push back because of rare examples of the pushback being too severe. Bonetta, thank you. Someone is making a case to redeem the name Rupert. Rehabilitate the Rupert. So this is Rupert from Croydon, who's at great pains to distinguish himself from the previous Rupert. If you limited CEO pay to 80 times the average employee pay, James, then we could sit back and wait for all the squeals of, but we won't be able to attract a level of executive good enough to do the job. And then we could point to the current tranche of CEOs managing the various privatised industries who are constantly pumping raw sewage into our rivers and say, oh, do you mean that level of talent? Which is not, Rupert, necessarily quite as clever as you think it is, because from a dividend recipient or a shareholder's point of view, that's exactly the level of talent that they want. It's just that we've got a slightly different idea of what talents you should have in that role. From Bonetta to Brendan in Barming. Brendan, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Pleasure to meet you.
Likewise.
I can see we're up against the junction, so I'll try and take my little tail. It's been 15 years now, but I was in an IT project manager's job that was causing me so much stress that I'd been signed off with mental illness essentially. Gosh. And they tried to reintroduce. I stutter now. It's been 15 years. I'm stuttering now when I think about it. They tried to reintroduce me back in with a phased reintroduction, but they just dumped me straight back into the maelstrom.
Right.
It felt like there was somebody standing behind me with a cricket bat.
Yeah.
And I didn't know when, but I knew at some stage they were going to hit me on the back of the head. And I felt like that all day long.
Good Lord.
My journeys into work, I was literally having thoughts that you'd need a trigger warning for. So,
yes.
I was in a very dark place. I got my union rep involved, and to really truncate the story, he represented me at these meetings.
Right.
He got me a payout, a very, very good payout, because they'd made lots of mistakes in their duty of care towards me. And I was able to shrug that business off like a dirty raincoat, walk away with enough money to breathe for the first time in years. I retrained, and I've never been happier for the last 15 years. And I'm just contemplating retirement, and I've never been happier. But they were killing me. They were.
So you'd say they saved your life. Your union rep saved your life in a way.
Absolutely, not in a way.
You'd go that far.
I would go that far because I was having thoughts about spinning the wheel.
I do, and
I was in such pain.
And a lot of people will recognise what you describe. We touched on some of these elements yesterday during the conversation about working from home, and more pertinently, the idea that many of us grow up with. It's inculcated. We're not born with it. We develop the idea that, when the boss says jump, we all shout how high. If you are affected by any of the issues that Brendan and Bonetta referred to, if you are struggling, if you need to talk to somebody, then allow me to remind you that the Samaritans can be contacted on free phone 116 123, and there are other ways of getting in touch as well, email and the like. It's coming up to 11 o'clock. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I think we can now more or less all agree that trade unions are a force for good.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 11 is the time. I've had a message from the past. I don't think this has happened before. Bailey is currently listening on catch-up to yesterday's programme, but they have got in touch nonetheless, which is not necessarily something I am going to routinely register if you are sending me comments on yesterday's programme while I'm in the middle of presenting today's. But this one somehow caught my eye. So, good morning, James, writes Bailey from the past. Apologies for the delayed message, but I'm listening on catch-up. Regarding the working from home conversation you were having yesterday, if we're using Ian Duncan Donuts as a nickname, could we also implement Jacob Reese's Pieces? This man is, after all, a peanut. I love the show. Regards, Bailey. Brackets from the past. Close brackets. Does that work? I think that's very funny, Jacob Reese's Pieces, to go alongside Ian Duncan Donuts. But it's quite an American confection, isn't it, Reese's Pieces? They're delicious. I don't know if you've had Reese's Peanut Butter Cups or indeed Reese's Pieces. They are delicious, but they are American, which means the quality of the chocolate is not as high as you would hope for, although, to be honest, since Cadbury's got bought by an American company, the quality of their chocolate has, to my palate, diminished somewhat. Do you know the really delicious chocolate? Have you had, is it Tony's Chocolonely? We look forward to hearing from Bailey again tomorrow on the subjects of the trade union conversation that we've just had. Have you had Tony's Chocolonely? Have you had that? That's you know when you eat chocolate. Did I recommend that to you? And do you agree? Did you agree with my assessment? It's what you think chocolate tastes like in your memory banks. If you're, I don't know, 20 or older, you could, before Cadbury's got bought, that taste that you had, and now you buy a dairy milk and you think, that's nice, but Easter eggs are probably the biggest test of what chocolate tastes like, aren't they? When you have an Easter egg and you think, that's not quite as delicious as I remember chocolate being. And then you think, maybe it's just a sign of age. Maybe my palate is deteriorating in the same way that my knees are, or my eyesight. But then you have Tony's Chocolonely, which is quite a big brand now. You can find it in most places. And then you eat your Tony's Chocolonely and you think, ooh, that's what chocolate is supposed to taste like. So you pay a bit more for it. But it's worth it, in my opinion. Jacob Reese's Pieces. Shall we try that? I mean, to be fair, touch wood, we're not going to be talking about it much anymore. It's a shame we didn't come up with that sooner, Bailey. It's a shame you didn't text me even longer ago in the past than you did today. Because if we'd had Jacob Reese's Pieces in place, where we were talking about him most days, because the damage that him and his ilk were doing to this country was live and still unfolding, we could have used it alongside Ian Duncan Donuts. But there we are. Ian Duncan Donuts, Jacob Reese's Pieces. I digress slightly. Much more serious conversation now than anything chocolate related. I'm going to talk about Stop and Search. There's a remarkable piece in at least one newspaper today, although for reasons that you don't need me to explain, many newspapers and indeed many radio presenters would probably choose to ignore this story given the opportunity. And it finds that the most effective anti-violence tactic in the context of violent crime, knife crime and similar, is focused deterrence. This achieved a 33% reduction in incidents, which is 6 times greater than Stop and Search. In fact, this research published today by the Youth Endowment Fund, which is a charity funded by the Home Office to combat youth violence, found that Stop and Search by police is one of the less effective tactics to tackle rising violence such as knife crime. So it was never, to my mind, about tackling knife crime, Stop and Search. I hate to say this, and I hesitate to say it as well, because there may be people popping up in your mind who are guilty of the offences that I'm about to describe. But Stop and Search conversations, since I started working at LBC, I'd never really had conversations about Stop and Search, but I realised pretty quickly, reading some of the coverage and listening to some of the responses, I realised pretty quickly that Stop and Search, quotes, debates, end quotes, were largely about people trying to cling on to the idea that you can treat black people as second-class citizens. Most Stop and Search debates I've heard over the years have been really close to saying the quiet part out loud, which is, well, of course they should be treated differently from me because they're black. I don't know if you remember the conversations that we had about policing during the lockdowns, when suddenly elderly white men discovered what it was like to be presumed guilty until you were innocent. You know, if you were just going for a walk or eating a sandwich on a park bench or daring to venture outside of the catchment area that the government had dictated you were allowed to explore on your daily walk. Do you ever look back on that period and think that it was surreal? Can't quite believe that. Do you remember the daily walks? Do you remember going for your daily walk? Do you remember going for your daily walk? Absolute madness. But the people who were supremely comfortable with the idea of young black lads being slung over the bonnet of a police car every 20 minutes on the proviso that they might possibly be guilty of an unspecified crime, suddenly we're having the mother of all meltdowns when police were empowered to tell them that they couldn't go for a walk more than 1.5 miles outside their own front door. It was an extraordinary volte-face, if that's the correct turn of phrase. It really was. And of course, they didn't notice. They went straight back afterwards when they were now no longer being policed in that way. They went straight back to arguing that, absolutely nothing wrong with the fact that black people are 4 times more likely to be subject to a stop and search than white people. And then, in order to cover up their innate and largely unpleasant, I beg your pardon, entirely unpleasant but largely innate racism, they would then say, well, it works, doesn't it? It works. Except, of course, it doesn't. It's one of the least effective tactics for tackling rising violence, which is hardly surprising. It remains, says the executive director of the foundation, an essential police power, but increasing the number of searches is no silver bullet on knife crime. In fact, when used poorly, it has little effect on violence and erodes trust in the police. So these are the things that work. I'll tell you who's very good on this. No, I won't. I've forgotten his name. What's the name of the guy with the crazy hat? Malcolm Gladwell's very good on this. Malcolm Gladwell, I think he did my podcast a few years ago. I've certainly interviewed him, and he spoke in detail about what actually works in the context of reducing violent crime. A high police presence in areas where violence is high, making sure that children arrested with knives get corrective support fast, targeting those heavily involved in violence. It's not about being tough or soft on crime, says John Yates, the executive director of this foundation. It's about being smart. We have to do what works. So stop and search estimated to have affected a 5% drop in violence in England and Wales. Focused deterrence, as in smarter policing, going for the people, if you like, that are responsible for the violence, rather than treating every black lad in London as if he's about to be or might be, focused deterrence delivers about 33%. So there are 2 questions for me, or rather for you here. I want to know what impact being stopped and searched had on your life, positive or negative. I don't want to exclude the possibility of positive. I find it unlikely that huge numbers of people who were either violent enough or frightened enough to carry a knife would be dissuaded from doing so by the fear of it being found by a police officer, but perhaps it does. What I want you to tell me is what it did to you, because one of the most extraordinary moments I've had in all the years I was presenting this program came when I was in the middle of doing an introduction to a conversation about stop and search, and a thought suddenly occurred to me. It was about the 4th or 5th time I've done it, and we've all heard countless radio phone-in conversations about stop and search, but have you ever noticed what's wrong with almost all of them? Have you? Most of the contributors are not speaking from personal experience. White men in their 50s and 60s or 40s hosting radio programs about young black men being stopped and searched would speak almost exclusively to white men in their 40s, 50s and 60s about the reality of young black men being stopped and searched almost willy-nilly. And so I'm in the middle of doing a phone-in introduction, a bit like I am now, and I suddenly thought to myself, I don't want to hear from you about something that doesn't affect you. I don't want to hear your barely camouflaged racism about why you're perfectly comfortable with all black people being treated as if they're guilty until they can prove that they're innocent. I want to know what it's actually like. And it was a moment in the years that I've been doing this of quite profound significance. It was the moment I really understood the power of personal experience over mere opinion. Now, opinions are important, and lived experience is not the beginning and the end of any conversation. There's lots of things I have very strong opinions about that I have no lived experience of whatsoever. But my goodness me, the way in which right-wing media had dominated the narrative, and right-wing police officers and many, many racists had dominated the narrative of stop and search conversations without actually being personally affected by it, either positively or negatively. And even if, as a potential victim of crime, you think that it is something that affects you, then the news that it's one of the least effective ways of tackling violent crime should be the point at which you recognise all of the calls to turn it up, to do it more, to ramp it up are pointless, are not working. So, question number 1, how did being stopped and searched affect you? What impact did it have on your life? Either as someone who was involved in or potentially involved in violent crime, or as someone who was not, who never would have been. So the two impacts there. The person, if you like, at whom stop and search tactics are supposed to be directed, and the person at whom they're not, but who usually by dint of skin colour would have been caught up in the net, as it were. The wider the net was cast, the more likely you were to be caught up in it. So how has it impacted on your life? 0345 6060 973. And the second question is one I don't think I have asked before. The second question is, what actually worked? So for this to take flight, you will need to be quite brave. You will need to admit to me that you were involved, either actually or potentially, in violent crime. Okay? I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to learn from you. So you will need to be somebody who has had involvement in or been adjacent to violent crime. And I want to know what got you out of that orbit. What actually worked for you? 0345 6060 973. So question number 1, what impact did it have, has it had, does it continue to have on you? And question number 2, what actually worked? What did actually, and it may be that it was stop and search, you may answer both questions with the same story, but what actually got you out of that cycle of violence? Because, phrases like deterrence are a bit vague, aren't they? Putting more officers on the streets in troubled areas, mentoring, diversion for potential suspects, all of those words will assume much greater weight if they become part of an actual story, a lived experience. I'm going to open up the phone lines now. It's 16 minutes after 11. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and the number you need to contribute to this and indeed every conversation that we have together every day is 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC.
19 minutes after 11 is the time, and this is a story, this is a conversation about a tactic that doesn't work very well. So all of your Daily Mail directions to talk about, well, black people are more likely to carry knives, or black people are more likely to be involved in violent crime, they don't count for anything in this conversation. Save yourself tuppence and put your phone down. This is a conversation about something that doesn't work very well. Stop and search. 4 times more likely to happen to you if you're black. So what does it achieve? And what does work? Those are the questions. This is interesting from Steve, who's in Bristol. I took my elderly dad to Lord's last year, James. As we came out of the ground, we witnessed police closing in and stopping and searching a young black man who had run past us out of breath and sweating. We'd never seen this before, so we turned and watched the situation play out. It turned out that he was a barman at the ground, late for work. My elderly father was so infuriated by what he had seen that he chastised the police who had done it. It gave us both a glimpse of what it must be like for young black men to whom this happens frequently. And that there, right there, that just cancels out all of your faux statistical justifications that you use to cover up the fact that you're perfectly comfortable with black men being treated like that by the police. And I ran out of patience with pretending that this conversation was about anything else some time ago. This comes with a request for me not to share the name. I was stopped and searched when I was 15. I had 2 knives on me. Neither of them were found. And this made me feel empowered to carry on doing so for several years. The only cure I found was leaving the area. I moved to the opposite end of the country because I met someone. And that was also what got me out of joining a gang. If an issue is embedded in the entire area, then the only solution seems to be to escape. Except for the people who can't escape, the solution seems to be focused deterrent, moving into the areas where the incidences are most likely and mentoring the young people most at risk. Glasgow is a good example of this, actually, and a reminder that it can be as much about class in different parts of the country as it can about ethnicity. Anthony is in Rothwell. Anthony, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you?
Very well, mate. What's on your mind?
Good. So it's just in response to your first question. So I grew up in Tottenham as a young black man. And my mum always, the rule was you're home before the street light come on, and we always stayed out of trouble. We got involved in gangs. Well, we moved away to Bedford, but it followed us in terms of the people we're socialising with. But as I got older, I made sure I looked after myself, and I was working 16 hours a day in social care, so I'd be getting home late.
Crikey. That's a shift.
On occasion, I got pulled over by the police at, say, 10:30, 2 in the morning, and they pulled me over in a petrol station, and their response was, "We've been looking for you for a while." And at the time, I was too young and naive to know that they can't just search my car without probable cause.
Right.
And they just started searching the whole vehicle. And they kept me there for about 15 minutes and then just said, "On your way." And then the second occasion, again, late at night, cars followed me through Bedford town at the time, and then he's pulled me over about 5 minutes from my house. Just come to the car and just said, "Can you turn your vehicle off, please?" And then as I've done that, looked to the left, another vehicle sped around the corner and surrounded me. But again, no explanation as to why they pulled me over. They just kept me in the car and just kept me quiet. And I had no associations with anyone, wasn't committing any crime. And then a few days after that, I got pulled over again in a bus stop, in a public bus stop. And his excuse was he was speeding as he pulled off from the lights. And bear in mind, I was driving next to a bus that pulled off next to me. And again, all those stops, there was no actual valid explanation. And in saying that, I don't hate the police.
No, I was about to ask, what effect did it have on you?
Ironically, growing up in Tottenham, when I go back, I don't get nervous when I'm there with regards to the police being around me. But when I'm out in the countryside where I live now, I get very nervous. Because where we did live, we were the only black family. And even where I live now, I live in a white country, which I appreciate and respect completely. So I expect to see more English and white people around me.
Yeah.
But when you're the one that sticks out, you do feel it. And you do feel the looks. I don't know why it's like that in certain communities, because we are very multicultural and we are educated. But some people just inherently seem to just carry it with them, whether it's the training they receive or it's just the culture they're around. And it makes me sad. And the effect it's had is I've grown up where my mum would say, because her best friend's Irish as well, she would say, "Be careful, you're the black lad there, you have to make sure you're doing everything right." And I used to say, "Mum, you're just overreacting, it's silly, come on." But as I got older, I could see what she was talking about. And it just makes me sad. And then it makes me sad for my child who's still young, because I hope as he gets older, things improve. But given my mum's 65 now and I'm 32, it doesn't show me much change in that time, you know? But
the media pendulum swings as well, doesn't it? But that's why research into how effective it is should really be the only conversation that is had in one context, and then the negative impacts that it has on wholly innocent people is the other side of the coin. I'm going to presume, or perhaps pretend, that a message coming into the studio that says something like, "If you've got nothing to hide, then you've got nothing to fear," is sent in good faith rather than as a sort of camouflage for racial prejudice. What do you say to people holding that opinion, given that you've just told us about being stopped and searched with absolutely no rationale or justification on multiple occasions, some of which very, very close to each other? You've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear, Anthony.
You can have nothing to fear, but at the same time, when people don't understand the situation or they're confused, when you don't have all the information present, you get upset, you get scared, you get angry. And people can be put into leading situations where they say the wrong thing, even if you have nothing to fear or hide. I've always been a calm person, so I've never overspoken or said what I don't need to. I just wait till I have that information. But there are people out there that aren't built the same way as me, and they will present fear or nerves, and it doesn't mean they're guilty. It just means they're just fearful of that situation because they don't actually know what's happening.
I wonder how quickly it escalates as well. You remind us everybody's different, which is helpful, actually. So, some people have short fuses, some people have long fuses. But, even if you've got the longest fuse in the world, if there's going to come a point where your patience expires, isn't there? You're just, why the hell are you doing this to me again?
I think you hit one of the key points on the head, though, earlier. The media does cause a lot of problems. So, obviously, media will portray different things on social media to me than it will to you. And I found for a long period of time, especially during Black Lives Matter, which for me as a black man, I didn't agree with half of it due to the political side of it. Okay. A lot of the media that was presented to me was negative, whereas a lot of the media that was presented to my partner, who's a young white girl from Yorkshire, was completely the opposite. And parts of what I've seen was starting to make me angry, so I had to switch off because I know there's both sides of the coin, and I know it's not just... so I'm talking in terms of worldwide, sorry.
Yes, of course.
I know it's not just young black men on a worldwide level getting stopped by the police or harassed by the police. I could switch off from that.
Yeah, this is where the research, Akala has done this in his superb book Natives, talking about what happened in Easter House in Glasgow and looking at the relationship between poverty and violent crime, which is a historical fact, but some people prefer to believe, or at least prefer to pretend to believe, that there's some sort of relationship between ethnicity and violence. And I don't know how much time you spend looking at the kind of social media that helped to incite the riots that we saw recently, the level of obsession with this idea that ethnicity is related to criminality, or that a certain ethnicity is going to create a higher likelihood of violence or criminality is, I mean, it's absolutely off the charts now on Musk's platform. It's quite horrifying how tight a grip that has got on corners of that particular platform. I'm not familiar enough with the other ones to comment on it, but that's why Glasgow is often used as a measure on this. But there's a pilot underway in Coventry, Nottingham, Leicester, Manchester and Wolverhampton as well. So the Glasgow one, it was predominantly white young people carrying knives, and the research and the response that went into trying to fix that was extraordinary. Well worth reading up on. Thank you, Anthony. It's coming up to 11:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Feargul Sharkey will join us shortly to tell us about the latest salvo in his war upon water pollution. He is leading a mass rally over the government's failure, the new government's failure to have tackled this issue after its first 100 days in office. We'll find out more about that before 12 o'clock today. But now it's Thomas Watts with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
33 minutes after 11 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the conversation is about research showing that stop and search is a very poor way to cut violent crime. So, you can dispute the expertise, you can dispute the research, but what you can't do is justify the fact that black people are 4 times more likely to be subject to a stop and search by claiming that it's effective or by claiming that it works, when we know that targeted deterrence, focused deterrence, achieves a 33% success rate compared to a 5% success rate for stop and search. So what worked for you? When you look back to the time when you either did or very nearly fell into knife carrying or picked up a knife, carried a knife, what rescued you? What pulled you back? What worked? And listen, if it was being stopped and searched, then your voice needs to be heard. I don't want to suggest for a minute that it's an entirely ineffective policy or an entirely ineffective practice. When it is done well, I'm never entirely sure what that means, then it is a good thing, a helpful thing, a useful thing. But what works better? What worked for you? 0345 6060 Tony picks up on the nothing to hide, nothing to fear line. He says, it works the first time, James, maybe, but by the fourth or fifth time you feel victimised and see it as a racist tactic. And of course, white people are stopped and searched as well, as some correspondents never tire of telling me, but that doesn't alter the statistic that black people are 4 times more likely to be subject to a stop and search than white people. And you can't justify that by saying it works, because we know that it doesn't. 11:34 is the time. Cliff is in Lambeth. Cliff, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. How are you?
Very well, mate. What's on your mind?
No, I just thought if I had to call in terms of just the question. I'm a young black man myself, 43 years of age.
I don't know if that's young anymore, Cliff. Does that count as young? Go on. Sorry. What a hair split. Carry on.
I was 14, 15, making my way home from basketball, and I was stopped by 2 officers, and the aggression and the language used to me at that age, being about 7:30, 8 o'clock at night, a 14-year-old left a massive impact on me as a teenager. I was coming back from basketball, something I used to do as a child, and just making my way home. It was about 7:30, 8 o'clock at night during the winter times. When I was stopped saying that I'd matched the description of someone in the area, I said I was 14, 15, and the way the officers actually approached me and spoke to me, it made me have a very negative opinion about the police force for a number of years.
So it created a problem in a sense. I presume you'd never acted upon your negative opinion of the police force, but who knows what happens subconsciously. And you were not in any danger of falling into gang culture or knife crime?
Not far from it. I mean, the thing that I found and remembering, looking at conversations, it just reinforced a lot of things that I had heard as a young person, from hearing from family members, friends, experiencing myself. It just added on to what I had heard, and I did have a negative opinion about the police force for a number of years until I became a young man within society and learning more. But for a good 5 or 6 years, I definitely would see the police and would have straight away negative thoughts and negative opinion about them from my experiences myself as a 14, 15-year-old.
And as a child, we should say, really, as a child. Yeah. And extrapolate from that lack of cooperation with police sometimes when there is crime in the black community, and you can begin to understand why. It's because you perceive the police as a threat or an enemy because of the way that they have behaved towards you. And that's bad for everybody. That's bad for victims of crime. It's bad for the police service. It's bad for everybody.
And the thing about it was interesting. After that incident, there was about 3 or 4 occasions years afterwards that I had been stopped for exactly the same reasons. We're stopping you because you match a description of an incident that's happened in the area. Unfortunately, it's something that a number of my friends have been through. And it does put a negative...
How can it not? I mean, it's like that message I read just before you came on when it says you might just about be able to chalk it up as nothing to hide, nothing to fear the first time it happens. But by the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th time it's happening, it ceases to be something that's fair or even logical.
Yeah, and the only thing about it, I'm a father of 2, and I worry about my children in society for that reason as well. And I know I'm not the only one out of a group of friends, but we have children that are now teenagers that are out in society trying to live life. Yes. And we do have those worries. If they do come across an interaction with an officer, how are they going to be treated, and how are they going to feel after that?
Has it happened? It hasn't happened yet.
No, I'm lucky enough, touch wood, it hasn't happened to even my boy.
You have to hope that that's
unfortunately
one place where things have got better. It's happened to your friends' children, has it?
Well, I'm actually a grassroots coach, so I've been coaching for about 7 years, and unfortunately we've had a number of boys over the years that have been making their way to training or making their way home from training, and they have unfortunately gone through this experience.
And it is, I think, fair to describe it as a presumption of guilt until you can prove that you're innocent, which is the opposite of how we are supposed to be policed.
Yeah, and if a lot of people sat down with these young boys and spoke to them and asked them how they felt after that experience, it would bring a lot of people to tears. When you're speaking to a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old who's only making his way from football or from going to football, coming back from football, and he's been stopped by an officer because he's either matched a description of an area, and it happens to them or it happens to their friends, and then you speak to them and you can see the hurt and the anger in them, and their children are going through these experiences. And unfortunately, as coaches, we, support them, but we unfortunately know this is going to happen because we've experienced it as young black coaches ourselves. And this was 20, 30 years ago, and we've still got young people going through that same experience now.
And you've still got politicians and pundits jumping up and down demanding more of it without paying any attention whatsoever to the statistical evidence that it is ineffective. It is considerably, measurably less successful than countless other practices. Thank you, Cliff. And I'm going to repeat that again because, the idea that you look at crime statistics and therefore decide to treat people of a certain ethnicity as if they're guilty until they're proven innocent, whether you realise it or not, is racist. How would you feel as a white person if you had to prove you weren't a rioter 4-5 times a year? I'm sorry, there's been some riots around the corner. There's been some race riots around the corner. I'm going to have to stop and search you. There's been some race, because almost all of the race rioters in the Feargul riots were white, right? Almost all of them. In fact, all of the ones I saw, but just by statistics, there must have been a couple of other people there who maybe weren't. So what does that mean? What can we conclude about the entire white population from the fact that all of the rioters in the Feargul race riots were white? Can we make any statistical conclusions about that? Can we make any decisions about how the entire white population of the United Kingdom should be policed based upon the fact that pretty much all of the rioters in the Feargul riots were white? Can we do that? Because that's what you're doing when you tell me, have a look at the statistics involving knife crime. That's what you're saying. You don't realise you're saying it because you are either accidentally or deliberately racist. Because if it was you being treated as if you are guilty until you're proven innocent, you wouldn't like it at all. So how are we going to do that? What are we going to do? What conclusions can we draw? Well, how should the police treat every white person in the country as a consequence of the fact that all of the race rioters earlier this month were white? You see how stupid that is? You've got to treat all white people in a different way because of crimes committed by some white people. Do you see? I hope you see. I hope you see now. Cassius is in Greenwich. Cassius, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I was just following up on what the last caller said as well, because as a black guy, I remember when I was growing up having my uncle and my mum giving me the conversation of how I have to be if I get stopped by police. Don't give them a reason to put you on the floor. Don't give them a reason to throw you in the back of the van. Yeah. So you get that indoctrinated in you from your parents and relatives, how to be with kids, how to be as a child, how to be with the police. And when you get stopped a number of times, and it's always a nonsense reason. It's never a clear reason. It's always, you've matched the description, or you've done this. And then they want to search you, be able to search, and they don't even apologise. They're just, okay, and they talk to you so aggressively, like you're already guilty before they even done anything. I remember the first time I got stopped, I was with a group of friends, and we was in West End, coming out of Selfridges, walking down the road, and a police car pulled up behind us, and they didn't say excuse me, they're just like, oi, who are you talking to? So I carried on walking, because my name's not oi. And they jumped out, and the rest of them, they come and said, didn't you hear us call you? And said, no, I heard you say oi. And then as soon as you give them a little bit of mouth, they try to talk to you even harder. But they really wanted to draw the handcuffs on you and stuff. As I was saying, researcher, the most recent time I got stopped, I was in my car. I live in Bexley, which is in Kent. And I was in Essex, in the county of Essex, and I had two cars behind me, and they were following me. So I was going to my friend's house. So I pulled over. I thought, I'm not bringing the police to my friend's house. Pulled over, and they got out of the car. They come to me. I said, yes, officer, how can I help you? He said, the reason why we're stopping you is because your car's registered in Kent. I went, and?
Shut up.
My friend was on the phone at the time because they couldn't believe it. And I was like, what? Because your car's registered in Kent. I said, are you serious? They said, oh, yeah. And the second thing, because you've got tinted windows. I went, well, my tints are fine because they're done legally. Right. And my car's registered in Kent. I said, has my car been reported stolen? No. Has it got road tax? Has it got insurance on it? Yes. Has it got tax on it? Yeah. I mean, so what's the problem? oh, well, you couldn't, well, you know, your car could have been stolen. But do you know where I live? Do you know where I keep my car? No. So you're literally stopping me because what you've got to appreciate is that it's a nice car.
Well, I was going to ask about that, but you've already answered that question. What do you think what was a good result for them in that context? Do you see what I mean? Were they hoping that you were, because you're a black man in a nice car, they're hoping you're a drug dealer, or they're hoping you're a thief?
I'm pretty sure that's what it was. I'm not going to lie. At the end of that stop, I was really peed off.
Yes.
At the end of the voice, I'm not going to lie. I was really peed off. I did say a smart Highlight comics because I leaned that I said, all you need to do now is ask me if this is my car, if it's registered to me, and if I've got any my driver's license on it. So he said, "Have you?" I said, "Gave me driver's license." They went and done their checks. They came back. And he said, well, what you got to appreciate is that you got a nice car and it could have been stolen. I said, it's 7:30 at night.
Yes.
Why would I be asleep? Right, first of all, and you said about my car being registered in Kent. So basically, if I want to drive to a different county, I have to have another car in each county. So I don't get stopped by
That's like the Dukes of Hazzard. You know what I mean? You get over the county line, you're free, you're clear. I shouldn't laugh, but it is.
I laugh about it now, but at the time I wasn't laughing about it. Yeah, so it just made me think. And as I was saying to your researcher, I remember when that happened with George Floyd, because I've got kids myself, and 3 of them are boys. And my youngest at the time, he was 4, coming on 5. And he turned around to me and we was watching the news. He said, "So, Daddy, why is the policeman on his neck like that?" I thought, and it was like that penny dropping. I'm thinking, damn, I ain't had a talk with you guys yet. So then I've had to have the talk with them about how they have to be with the police. And it's like, you're thinking, this should have changed by now. And it's not. It's just not changing. All that's changing is the day and the year, but the procedures are still the same.
Goes up and down, I think, a bit. Depending on who the commissioner is or who the Home Secretary is, but you'd think that the conversation would be drawing to a close when you look at how ineffective it is as a tactic anyway. If the priority is actually reducing violent crime, as opposed to indulging stereotypes or allowing police officers to go on power trips or whatever it may be, or appeasing unpleasant commentators and politicians, then the conversation would be winding to a close. But it isn't, is it?
You would think that, because I remember I had a police come to my house at like 5 o'clock on a Sunday morning, asking me who lives in my house. And asking me, and asking me about, like, I said, it's my son. I said, I've got my son's here. And he said, how old is your son? I said, he's 15. Why? And he's like, and this is like 5:30. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. Sunday morning. Obviously, I thought it was the delivery, because you do. Because I fell asleep on the sofa. Opened the door, saw the police. Obviously, straight away, the attitude changed. I'm not gonna lie, my attitude did change, because like, what the hell you ringing me? And then they started talking about my son. So I had to get a picture, showed them a picture of my son, and rather than say, "Oh, sorry, we've got the wrong guy," each time now starts giving me a lecture about telling me where I should let my son be and where I should not let my son be. What?
It is extraordinary. I didn't realise things that was so commonplace still. I knew it used to be, but as you say, the difference between the conversation that your parents had with you and the conversation that you have to have with your boys is absolutely identical. Nothing's changed in the course of your life, really, Cassius. Thank you. Graham makes an excellent point. He says, I've seen videos of some rioters recently kicking up such a fuss for being stopped after openly and actively committing crimes. I can only imagine how they would behave if they were stopped innocently on their way home from work or something. It is an extraordinary double standard, isn't it? And don't forget that the racists are trying to pretend that the two-tier policing works in the favour of people of colour, trying to pretend that the two-tier policing somehow discriminates against people who are highly unlikely to be stopped and searched in their lives. 11:48 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10 minutes to 12. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We mentioned water companies earlier as the gold standard, if you like, the proof, the most powerful proof of what can happen when profits are prioritised over absolutely everything that a company is supposed to be providing. I mean, it is still almost unbelievable to compare the state of our rivers, to look at the illegal sewage dumps that are now endemic in this country against the backdrop of the remuneration and the rewards, the pay and the packages that shareholders and executives in the companies responsible have undertaken. So something clearly needs to change, and something has to change. When it does, I think we can be fairly confident that much of the credit will belong to Feargul Sharkey, who has sort of reinvented himself in recent years as a tireless activist and campaigner in this field, and who is not planning on hanging up his megaphone anytime soon. And Feargul joins me now. So you were hopeful that the new government would signal an immediate improvement in this field, and you're disappointed.
Well, what we're seeing so far, James, is just the same litany of failure and incompetence, particularly from the regulatory system. You're absolutely right. Over the last weekend, 19 beaches along the south coast in the middle of the holidays have sewage warnings on them. Last week on Exmouth Beach, lifeguards were actually shouting at people over loudspeaker systems, warning them not to go swim in the sea on holiday because of sewage. In the background, Ofwat is now proposing and offering up that some people are going to see their water bills increase by up to 44% in today's money. Factor in inflation for the next 5 years. If you're a customer of Southern Water, your bill effectively is going up in real terms by up to 60%. It has to stop, and I, for one, have absolutely had enough, which is why today I'm working with a whole coalition, a whole range of organisations from the RSPB, the Women's Institute, British Rowing, the SOS Whitstable, Save Windermere. Saturday, the 26th of October, come to London. It's time we put boots in the streets. It's time we flooded the streets with our anger and our outrage and our refusal that we are not going to cooperate with this corrupt system any longer. It's a mass rally that you're calling for, but what? Absolutely. And this is on the 26th of October in London. Yep. River Action, Greenpeace, the Wildlife Trust, British Rowing, British Canoeing, all manner of organisations gathering under the banner. There's a new film out as well that Stephen Fry has narrated, and the phrase that resonates most is perhaps the desire to get Britain's water off life support. So what would a welcome government intervention look like, Feargul? What government needs to do right now is display leadership and urgency. What they need to do today, if they want these people's backing, is put a ban and a hold and a halt on these price increases, put a ban and a halt on any further dividend payments, any further bonuses, and announce a commission to now start looking into the gory detail, complete written branch review of what this industry has done, what the regulators have failed to do, what the industry's failed to do, and it needs to report back to Parliament independently within the next 4 or 5 months. It needs action and decisive action. What's your understanding of why this hasn't happened? And we're looking at 3.5 decades, so we can't pin it exclusively on the Tories or indeed on the current government. But what's your understanding of how it's been allowed to spool out like this for so long? Oh, well, ultimately, it was just the simple thing of lack of political oversight historically. And you are right, this goes back decades. And a regulatory system, as I write in one of the national newspapers today, in the shape of Ofwat, the economic regulator, we have a cohort of people, fervent disciples of the Chicago School of Economics. Regulations distort the operation of free markets. The market will provide. Even though they've made off with £78 billion of our money, the executives have been paid £54 billion over the last few years alone. Every river in the country is being destroyed. Oh, and by the way, let me remind Ofwat, there is no market. All we have is a bunch of state-granted monopolies. And one like Thames Water, to my certain knowledge, has now breached its operating licence 3 times in the last 6 months. And what on earth does the regulator do? Little of anything that I can see. I always welcome the mention of the Chicago School of Economics in these sort of conversations, because very prominent politicians still talk as if regulations are a bad thing or regulatory frameworks are undesirable. They like to use the phrase red tape to describe things that are better understood as protections for a population. They limit profit is what they really mean when they claim that they distort the operation of free markets. The newspaper you've written in, and it's an incredibly powerful piece, you've been lied to, you've been misled, you've been extorted. I can hear your voice here, Feargul, as you've been cheated and you've been abused. I can hear your voice. I do write like I'm talking out loud. That's a great gift. But it's in The Guardian, so there's a danger perhaps of preaching a bit to the converted. How confident can we be that this message and this call to action on the 26th of October is going to reach into parts of the population that
possibly aren't paying full attention.
I can give you an indication of that. The list of people you mentioned earlier on, one of the signees yesterday, one of the people now joining up to help deliver this is the Women's Institute.
Yes.
There is a clear message to any government. Once you have picked a fight with the Women's Institute, I'm afraid, my friend, you're going to lose. It's best now to just concede and come to an agreement where we can all move forward positively, respectfully, and get on with the rest of our lives without discussing other people's sewage.
I suppose the strange element of it is when I look at what it is that you're calling for, immediate and decisive action, including a set of measures in the legislation that will end the pollution of Britain's rivers, lakes and seas. So there is currently no plan, and you can give a little bit of leeway to the recently arrived government, but by the time you're assembling on October the 26th, they'd have been there for 100 days. There is currently no plan to address the continuous illegal dumping of raw sewage by the water companies. This is the bit that I almost find impossible to grasp, is that the official position is not just of the water companies, but of the regulator and of the government, that we're just going to carry on like this forever.
To further fuel your anger and your listeners' outrage, the chief executive of Ofwat actually admitted 2 weeks ago sewage should only ever be dumped into the environment in exceptional circumstances, i.e. incredibly rare, unique events, an act of God, force majeure. There is the man running the regulator, owning up. He knows what the law says. He knows what the law says for 35 years. What on earth has he ever done to try and enforce it?
It is breathtaking. Parliament Square, 26th of October, 2024. The highly unlikely case of somebody listening to this not having been previously aware of you and the work you do in this field. Why does your blood boil so much at this? I know there are obvious answers to that, which would apply to all of us, but why you, Feargul? Why has this fallen upon your shoulders?
I'm afraid I'm about to lapse into one of your other favourite areas of conversation. I blame the parents. I grew up in a household where if I saw what I perceived to be a social injustice, it was demanded of me to do something to try and rectify it, no matter how futile that might be.
Well, let's hope it's not futile, and I'm fairly confident you're not going to be resting any time soon. But what time are we assembling on the 26th in Parliament?
It will be for 2:00. If you go to marchforcleanwater.org, you get full details there. Sign up your friends, your relatives, the people in the next street over, your neighbours, your colleagues. I want to flood the streets with people's rage and anger, and it's time to turn that outrage into action.
And then the hashtag flood the streets all over social media, and Feargul's own account, I'll retweet the call to action from there. It's Saturday, the 26th of October, 2024, Parliament Square, London. And kick-off's at 2 p.m, so get there a little bit earlier if you can. I'm sure we'll catch up before then, Feargul, but more power to you in the meantime.
Look forward to it.
Always.
Look forward to it. Thank you again for the opportunity. My applause for all your support.
Cheers, Feargul. God bless. Take care. It's coming up to 12 noon. Now, I don't think it's cynical, is it, to mention that we did do a rather splendid full disclosure interview with Feargul last year, in which he talks a lot about what prompted him to get involved in this, but also about his time as as a pop legend, really, isn't it? There's no getting away from it. It's an incredible career change. You're listening to James O'Brien on at LBC, where I'm not quite sure what to do next. I know you think I say that with my tongue in my cheek when I've secretly got an absolutely crystal clear plan on what's going to come up. But I am quite drawn to the thing Tom was talking about regarding the television star Kirstie Allsopp coming in for a right old kicking because she let her 15-year-old son go interrailing across Europe. Why have we become so protective of our children?
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 3 minutes after 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I want to take a couple more calls on the conversation that we were having about stop and search and the research that shows it's simply not very effective. And I'm afraid the somewhat shaming realisation that many of the conversations we've witnessed in this field over the years have been very euphemistic attempts to justify the idea of treating people differently according to their skin colour, which categorically happens. You are 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched in the circumstances that we've described on the programme, that have been described to us by several callers, wholly and entirely innocent of any offence, but 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched if you're black than if you're white. And yet, of course, it's the kind of people that helped incite the riots earlier this month, who've started talking about two-tier policing as if it cuts in precisely the opposite direction. Absolutely surreal, really. But, we're living in an era where massive liars, often with racist undertones or overtones, up to and including Donald Trump, have enjoyed extraordinary success in the public space. So a couple more calls on that, and then we'll turn our attention to the story about Kirstie Allsopp, a sort of divisive public figure, and I'm on the positive side of that divide. I find her pretty fantastic, to be honest with you. But she's certainly not afraid of speaking her mind or putting herself out there on social media. And the latest cause for controversy is the revelation that she allowed her 15-year-old son to go interrailing across Europe with a friend who was themselves only 16. And social media being social media, the world and his wife think that they're perfectly entitled to not only sit in judgment upon her parenting choices, but tell her to her face, as it were, social media being what it is, what they think. I'll tell you what I think a little later this hour, and we'll find out what you think. But if I tell you that I think there's envy at play here, I think there's quite a lot of envy. And hopefully you're now wondering why I think that. And I will explain to you at around 20 past 12. But back to Stop and Search, the impact that it has upon your life and what actually works in the context of steering young people away from violent crime or the potential for violent crime. Chris is in Brixton. Chris, what would you like to say?
Good afternoon,
Hello,
James. I'd like to, as a legal, non-criminal black man, I've been stopped over 30 times by the police. I stopped counting at 30 because I just thought it was getting ridiculous.
Yes.
But to put that in perspective, in context, I grew up in a utopian enclave in Birmingham called Handsworth, where my primary school was part white, part Asian, part black. We'd have the local Bobby come along to say, "Hi, I'm the local Bobby," and he'd stand in front of the school and introduce himself. The same Bobby would knock my front door. My dad would open the door and he would say, "Hi, I'm local Bobby. I'm just coming to introduce myself. Any issues, you call me," yada, yada. Okay? I grew up a mile from the current head of the Met, who went to school with my brother, and the head of the Met's mother went to church with my father.
Gosh.
So that's the local area I grew up in.
Got it.
I then got a car. When I left that utopian enclave...
I've got to tell you, I've never heard Handsworth described as a utopian enclave before, but I like it. I hope it sticks.
I got a car and then ventured out into the wider parts of Birmingham in the 80s. And that's when it all began. Being stopped by the police, what felt like every week, and not treated particularly nicely by the police. And that transition from the local Bobby who would visit the school, knock on your door, to the policeman in the car and how I was treated.
Yes.
You want to know what effect
that
has had on my life.
Yes, I do.
That led me to believe that in those 30 police stops, those were 30 attempts by the police and society to put me in jail. I have not committed any crimes. I have never been arrested. I have had no convictions. I've never been put in handcuffs. But 30 times, the police have pulled me over and wanted to know who I was, what documents I have, what's in the vehicle, and they're not very nice about it. So I've grown up...
An understatement, I think, perhaps.
Right. So I've grown up with a feeling that this country that I was born in does not want me to be a free and equal citizen in this country. That's how I've grown up. I don't go to protests or, the million people marching against the war in Iraq. I don't go to these events because it's triggering to be surrounded by police. I'm thinking to myself, I find it hilarious when the countryside people who wanted to march against in support of fox hunting, then got truncheoned by the police. And I thought, wow, I hope you people now realise the type of person I'm dealing with on a weekly basis.
All the time. This is a stupid question, and you will forgive me, I hope, for it.
Oh, you never ask stupid questions.
I really do, Chris. But roughly, what point in the 30? So, because we've seen that you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. We've seen the response that might be true the first time. But when did it become endemic in your life? So, like the 5th time, the 10th time, when did you just think this is what my life looks like? This isn't an aberration. This isn't freakish or a one-off or a 10-off. When did it actually change the way you felt about your citizenship?
Between 5 and 10.
Yeah.
A bell went off.
Yeah, that's the phrase. There we go. And it's never stopped ringing, really.
No, I was working at an architect's in Birmingham,
right?
And I told my white colleagues, I get stopped all the time.
Yeah.
And they didn't believe it. They did not believe it. I was then the dedicated driver on a night out.
Right.
And we drove past a police car, passed in the opposite direction. The fella turned around, pulled us over, and did his usual job on me. To which all the people in the car berated him,
right?
As like, what are you talking about? Why are you behaving like this? He's with us. He's our Negro. You know what I mean? That sort of wonderful attitude. And why are you being like this? And from that moment, they understood. They saw it with their own eyes, how the police treat their black colleagues.
I think you have to, don't you? Even the most well-meaning people can not quite grasp it until they're sitting in the same car where it's happening, and they know there's absolutely no grounds for this whatsoever. You are black in charge of a car. That's the offence. Presumably that's a nice car or not? I don't know.
Well, back in the 80s, it was an MG Metro,
Not really. Well, the MG bit might have been enough to tip you over the edge. And for people confused about why you opened with so much context about your background, the point you're making is that until this started happening to you, your attitude to the police growing up in Handsworth was the same as my white middle-class attitude to the police going up down the road in Kidderminster. They were people to be trusted. They were people to break bread with, and they were people that you would turn to in times of trouble. And then that got taken away from you.
That got robbed.
Yes.
That got robbed, and a completely different worldview has then been hoisted upon me where... people say, back in the day, in the 80s and 90s, black people, they've got a chip on their shoulder.
Yeah, of course.
That chip was a mallet and a chisel done by society's agents called the police.
And you can't, you've done a brilliant job of articulating the depth of these offences, the depth to which they reach inside a person. But you, as you say, you can never quite get it until it's happened to you. You can never really feel it until you can imagine, but you can't feel, can you?
But was it deliberate? Was it deliberate? You'll have to ask a policeman. Ask a policeman, why do you stop more black people? What is in your heart and mind when you do that? Because the reverse effect of that is that black society does not trust or like the police.
No, and to its own detriment on occasion because of a lack of cooperation and because you can't trust. And what's interesting about the car points that you and other callers have made, and Cassius and others, is it robs the people who may not think they're being racist of their argument when they talk about crime statistics, because this isn't about knife crime. This is about driving a nice car while being black, and the same attitude translates into the stop and search.
Well, it didn't even need to be a nice car, James.
No, I know it didn't. I know it didn't. But it is. I think it does increase exponentially. But anyway, But I'm sorry. I'm really sorry that you've been through that. And the fact, how old are you now, Chris, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm now 58.
So we're of a similar age, a similar vintage, and it's still there, isn't it? It's still in your heart, this pain.
Yes. I get stopped. I don't get stopped anymore.
Why not?
Maybe the grey hairs.
Yeah?
I don't know what it is. There was a time when I reached about 30. It was suddenly switched.
I don't remember anyone explaining what it does to a person's relationship with their society as well as you've done, and I'm really grateful to you for that. It'll change the way I approach this topic in the future. What it does to your relationship with society. It's why that phrase, which is sometimes a bit hard to understand, policing by consent. You consent to being policed, and it damages that, it pollutes that principle. But that's the best explanation I've ever heard of what it can do to a law-abiding citizen's relationship with the society in which they live. This kind of policing, this kind of tactic. You've also reminded me that my guest on Full Disclosure this week is Neil Basu, the former police officer, head of counter-terrorism. He had more job, extraordinary career, but also profoundly engaged in the arena of race relations, both as a police officer and as a person of colour. His experiences in that field have been truly astounding. You'll enjoy listening to that, Chris, I think. 12:15 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 17 minutes after 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Apologies to everyone waiting to contribute to that conversation. You know that we'll return to it probably sooner rather than later. But Trevor, Jack, Michael, Diego, Paul, Andrew, thank you for getting in touch. But I do want to move on now to somewhat lighter territory. I couldn't work out why, when I heard Tom Swarbrick talking about this earlier today, I couldn't work out why my thoughts were going in the direction that they were going. Now, Kirstie Allsopp, the television presenter, is a particularly good fun on social media. She gets herself into some right old pickles and is never shy, shall we say, about expressing opinions that could be considered to be quite pungent sometimes, in a good way, you know, like a good cheese can be quite pungent. But she also sometimes stumbles into these controversies by posting things that she didn't realise were controversial. So when she posted about her delight at the imminent return of her youngest son from 3 weeks travelling on the continent, I'm not quite sure she knew that she was about to light the blue touch paper on whatever they're called these days, a Twitter storm. Or I wasn't comparing Kirstie Allsopp to an old cheese, but the word was pungent opinions, not a pungent person. But you know what it's like these days. You can get cancelled for talking about pungent opinions on this programme. You get sent to jail for saying you're English in this world. So the imminent return of her son from his holidays and her delight at the prospect, you wouldn't have thought at first glance would be grounds for a pylon or a storm on social media. But it was, for reasons that I think are pretty obvious when I tell you that her son is 15 years old. And therefore, the revelation that her 15-year-old son was coming back from his holiday. I'm just checking, actually, because what I don't think is... I don't think she would have mentioned his age, would she, in the original tweet? I should really look this stuff up before I start talking about it live on national radio, shouldn't I? But yeah, there you go. Oh no, she did. My little boy has returned from 3 weeks interrailing. He'll be 16 on Wednesday. So he went with a mate who's already 16 due to hostile travel restrictions. But they organised the whole thing themselves. This is a proud mum, right? Paris, Brussels, Amsterdam, Berlin, Munich, Marseille, Toulouse, Barcelona and Madrid. And talked about what an amazing experience he had been and how much he was likely to benefit from the experience. I don't know whether or not she was expecting to ignite an enormous row about this. Sometimes she gives the impression of quite enjoying the enormous rows. Other times less so. Other times she seems quite taken aback or spooked by the negativity that can be prompted. I'll give you an example, actually. She posted this morning, just got a kindly meant message from a friend saying, don't let the haters get you down. But I suspect he's been reading newspapers who almost always depict any debate on Twitter as much more toxic than it is. In fact, this has been one of the most interesting issues I've ever discussed on this platform. So many people have been in touch saying that in independent travel at a young age gave them enormous confidence, and they feel it played a part in who and where they are today. I tweeted about my son's travels because I was proud of him. See? I suffered with terrible homesickness, still do, and would never have done what he did, but now I feel not just proud of my child, but also happy that he is part of a fellowship of travellers, people who began young and have gone on to be positive, considerate people, it seems. And what's not to like? Well, I think I know what's not to like. I think there's a lot of envy out there. I think we know as parents, and my 18-year-old has just come back from interrailing, and for some of that time I was a mess. You worry, you fear the worst, you can't get hold of them. When I was that age, I could go for weeks without talking to my parents. Partly because of the sort of weird approach to life that boarding school gives you, but also because getting in touch was quite difficult. You had to queue up to use the phone at school or in your hall of residence. You had to queue up. Can you imagine being 18 listening to this now? You had to queue up to use the telephone to call your parents. That was the only way you could speak to them. I remember going on holiday to Mallorca when I was 11. The first time I'd ever been on an aeroplane. It was a desperately exciting experience for everybody involved. And I think in the 3 weeks I was away, there was one occasion where my friend's mum took me to the town square, like the post office in the town square in Mallorca, so that I could ring home, because they didn't have a telephone in the apartment because they only used it in the summer. So this idea of all the biggest generational changes that we've lived through together, contact has to be the biggest. You might think that having a super processor, a microprocessor in your back pocket has been the biggest social change, but it hasn't. Because, you've got an Encyclopedia Britannica in your pocket, potentially, with a smartphone. But you might have had an Encyclopedia Britannica in your sitting room. What you didn't have was a constant line of communication with the people you care most about in the world. I tried to explain the concept of writing letters to a girlfriend, and everyone thought I was a creep. Teenagers thought it was creepy. I used to send letters to my girlfriends. I said they weren't really girlfriends because we'd only see each other in the school holidays twice in a month. But my romantic heart at the age of 15 or 16 was beating away, and I'd write these letters and they'd write letters to me from a different boarding school to boarding school. And teenagers look at you as if you're some sort of pervert. You wrote letters. Yes, I did. I wrote letters. I used to love those letters. I've still got them somewhere. I think they're in the bottom drawer at my mum's, probably in the loft. They'll probably be collector's items. What about future biographers? They might want to read my love letter. You creep. But constant lines of communication. How would you be in touch? Queue up, phone up, 5pence. At prep school, good God, I'd forgotten about this. At prep school, you had to go to the deputy headmaster and ask for 5pence. I don't know why I said 5pence. I'm not that old. Ask for 5p. You'd ask for 5p and book a time to use the payphone in the hall of the school. And they did two things that are absolutely incredible looking back. They did two things. The first thing they did was make sure you hadn't phoned home too recently, because they worried that if you phoned home too often, you'd get homesick. Which is probably true. And you're most homesick when you're talking to your mum on the phone and you wish you were home with her. So they'd check, well, hang on, you phoned home last week, O'Brien. I think you better wait until next week. And then if you were allowed to phone home, they'd give you 5p and you'd book a time to make your phone call, and they'd put it on the school fees. The 5p would turn up on the statement of accounts that were sent to your parents at the end of term. That's how hard it was to keep in touch with your parents when I was young. When I was a teenager. My oldest goes away for the 3-week trip interrailing. We were away for 2 of them, but I'd get my Uber. Yeah, that's one good thing I like about Uber is I get the notifications. And oddly, sometimes the only way I knew they were safe was when the Uber had dropped them off back at the hostel they were staying in. But the amount of worry that you do as a direct consequence of the constant contact that you never asked for in the first place. It's a technological side effect, isn't it? And you don't even notice it until you suddenly realise that you're actually following your children around town on the Find My app to make sure that they're okay. This is when you were their age, you had to queue up to call them, and now you can actually watch them. You can say, oh, they must be on a train because they're going that. No one walks that quickly, and you're watching the icon move across the screen at 100 miles an hour. And that's why everyone is jealous of Kirstie Allsopp, because she has managed to overcome that entirely irrational parental paranoia from which we all suffer. That's why I think it's an envy issue. This, oh, I can't believe you've done that. It's so irresponsible. No, what you're really saying is, oh, I know that I'm actually a victim of irrational parental paranoia. I know that the risks that a 15-year-old faces in continental Europe today are no different from the risks that a 15-year-old faced in continental Europe 20 years ago or 40 years ago, or would face getting home from a pub in London. Not that you're supposed to be drinking underage. Cue another social media storm. So I think it's envy. And I don't know what to do about it. I'm quite lucky in a way. Mine are coming to the end of this period of their life, and they're late teens. But the irrational parental paranoia, do you think, oh my days... Do you know what the other story we were going to talk about this hour was? Do you know what it... Well, of course you don't know what it was. Anxiety among GCSE students. The fact that teachers report, as the results are due to come out tomorrow, that GCSE pupils suffering from anxiety saw more than 3/4 of teachers forced to make additional provision for them. So 77% of teachers reported seeing symptoms of exam anxiety among Year 11 pupils. Oh my days. I have never knitted those two things together before. It's contagious. So the irrational parental paranoia that we feel, the anxiety... Where are you? What are you doing? What's going on? We've communicated it to them. They've got a lot of other things to be anxious about, but the mystery, which was the second contender for this part of the programme, we're going to talk about why do they feel so much more anxiety than we did when we were taking exams? And the answer is because we are an anxious generation. The technology has made parents paranoid. And some of that paranoia translates into anxiety among the children that we are paranoid about. I think that's quite a profound insight, actually. Do you not? No? Well, you haven't got children, so you don't know what I'm talking about. Every parent listening to this has just suddenly gone, oh my goodness me, he's right. Part of the reason why children are anxious these days is because we're so anxious about them all the bloody time. All the time. With our apps and our social media trackers and keeping an eye on things. So, what's the flipping question? Now I've talked myself out of a topic. The question is why? Why are we so paranoid about our children when the risks they face are no greater than the risks we faced? Question number 1, 0345 6060 973. Stu's on form on the alliteration front. Persistent perennial parental paranoia, perhaps. Yes, persistent perennial parental paranoia. So the why of it, but also, actually, no, I prefer this, right? Ready? I think Kirstie Allsopp's a legendary mother. I think it's absolutely brilliant that she let her 15-year-old son go travelling at that age with his 16-year-old friend. I think it is courageous, and I think it is incredibly healthy. And I think she's helping him to a place where he is much, much, much less likely to suffer from the sort of anxiety described in the other story that is in front of us this morning. And I want to know whether you agree. That's all. Do you agree with me that Kirstie Allsopp's decision to let her 15-year-old son go travelling across Europe — interrailing is like a ticket you buy that gives you unlimited travel on railway networks right across continental Europe. So there's two questions here. And they're both about whether or not you agree with me. A, that this is brilliant parenting, and B, the negativity being directed at her comes from a place of envy. Envy and embarrassment, because I've got daughters, it's different. And in fact, she said, I think, that she wouldn't have let a 15-year-old girl go on that trip in the same way. And I think that I probably agree with that, rightly or wrongly. But the social judgment here, that's the phrase that Sheena uses very, I think, winningly. The social judgment comes from a place of shame, because you know it would be good for your son to do this, but you also know that you're too scared to let him. And you also know, if you dig deep enough into this, you also know that your fear is irrational. So it's envy of Kirstie Allsopp that's going on here. 0345 60 60973 is the number you need. Do you agree with me that what Kirstie Allsopp has done is an act of extraordinary parenting in the modern world? Or do you agree with me that a lot of the negativity being directed at her comes from a place of envy? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. It's 12:32.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:35. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And do you know what else is going on here? There's another element of envy that's kicking in. Chris says, what sort of parent would let their child go travelling alone at that age? Let me get this right. Really, James? Envy? 15 years old? Why would any responsible adult allow their 15-year-old child to travel abroad on their own? He wasn't on his own. He was with a 16-year-old friend. But there's envy there, and you don't realise it. It's a different kind of envy. It's not envy that she's not paranoid in the way that so many parents are. It's envy that she's got a 15-year-old that she knows would be capable of looking after himself in these circumstances. How many of the people attacking Kirstie Allsopp on Twitter were looking at their own 15-year-old and thinking, not in a million years. The lad can barely make his own breakfast. I'm not letting him go to France. So she knows she's got a son who's capable of looking after her. Envy to the left of me, envy to the right of me. It's all about envy. And what are they all so frightened of? I can't really get away with that, can I? What are we, I should say, all so frightened of? Susan's in Bradford. What do you think, Susan?
Hi.
Hello.
Well, when my son was 17, me and my mum went halves and paid for him to go to America to be in a Slipknot video. So he made his way there himself. And Corey Taylor, the lead singer, was so impressed by this crazy kid coming from the UK that he invited him to stay with him and his wife and his little baby for the week. And they took him out. They took him sushi bars, to the cinema, bought him some clothes. And it was just like, yeah.
What, I mean, had they advertised for people to appear in the video?
Yeah, in Kerrang. They were saying, if all of you, but it was for people in America, wasn't
clearly,
it? You know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah. It was in where are they based? Des Moines or something?
Is it? I don't know. Why are you asking me? I've hardly ever heard of Slipknot.
What
song was it?
That was the video. Duality.
Duality. That's an absolutely extraordinary video.
Black.
Where is he in it?
He's an orange prison shirt.
I'll look for him next time I settle down to some Slipknot. And what did people around you say? So obviously your mum was in on it, but did other people think that you were incredibly? They're borderline calling social services.
No. I know. This was, my son was born in 87 and he was 17, so it was a few years ago.
Yes. I
think people weren't so sort of projecting this sort of like constant fear on their kids. Do you know what I mean? And being scared about what's outside when, I think you're just doing more damage for your children. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Well, unfortunately, I both know what you mean and recognise that I have fallen into that trap myself a bit over the years. Possibly a lot, possibly more than I realise. And not so much on a 15-year-old or a 17-year-old travelling, but looking at Iowa, Des Moines, apparently, Ben tells me. Des Moines, Iowa. Des Moines, Iowa. There you go.
Yeah. He's the fan, I'm not.
Chris is very jealous. He says, I love Slipknot, and Corey Taylor is a great guy. Guys, all happening on the show today. Why, briefly, do you think that we have become, or that slightly older generation, the generation of parents behind you, the ones coming up behind you, have fallen into such a paranoid place?
Well, I don't know, because my daughter's 15. She's just come back from Turkey. She's half Kurdish, and her dad lives out there. So I took her to Manchester Airport. I got all.
And then he met her at the other end.
Yeah,
well, that doesn't really count, does it? It's not exactly flying to America to appear in a Slipknot video unaccompanied.
I know, but it's still sort of like she was still really proud of herself when she came back.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, I didn't mean to suggest she shouldn't be. And there'll be some parents who wouldn't let their 15-year-old do that. Wouldn't let their 15-year-old travel unaccompanied. It's fear. Fear of what? Fear of the unspecified. I like that, Susan. I shall look out for your boy. Is he easily recognisable?
Please do. Sorry?
Is he easily recognisable?
Well, you see flashes of this orange shirt, and then his head bagging with this sort of black. He's got black rimmed glasses.
Right, what an amazing achievement. What does he do now? What does he do now? Has he got his own band?
He's a manager in Marks and Spencer's.
Oh, there you go.
In the food department.
Fantastic. Is he still in touch with Corey Taylor? Christmas cards.
I don't think it was something he milked. Do you know what I mean? I think we saw him a couple of times.
I like this a lot. What a great story. What a great story. Thank you, Susan. 12:39 is the time. I'll tell you what I am also interested in, getting Jip for being non-paranoid in the way that Kirstie Allsopp has done, although she's perfectly comfortable with the conversation. And she's right, newspapers essentially, it's another came under fire last night. Do you remember yesterday? Who came under fire last night yesterday? You're talking about came under fire last night. Oh, it was the working from home story. The Labour government came under fire last night, and then you read into the story and it was Ian Duncan Donuts and Jacob Rees-'s Pieces. That's not coming under fire. That's like being savaged by a wet gerbil. I've come under fire. Oh no, who's attacking you? Ian Duncan Donuts and Jacob Rees-'s Pieces. That's not coming under fire. Kirstie Allsopp came under fire last night for allowing her 15-year-old son to go interrailing across Europe. What is the thing you let your children do that causes other parents to look at you askance? So you know that they're judging you, but you also know that you're right. And now that you've listened to me explain all of this, you know that they're actually secretly envious. Frank's in Tameside. Frank, what would you like to say?
Still trying to sell the farm, James.
Carry on. Still trying to sell the farm. Hang on a minute. I just want to establish that's not some sort of figure of speech. You are literally trying to sell your farm. I don't want anyone listening for the first time to think, what's he on about now? He's got a secret code. But you are. Why have you phoned in today? What's going on today?
Paranoia with the modern generation. Where's it come from?
I don't know, but you're supposed to tell me.
Yeah, I used to walk 1.5 miles home from school every night. Nobody to pick me up.
Yes.
I had one day with my parents taking me to school when I was a kid, and then it was on the Little Daimler bus off to school on your own. We were the baby boomer generation. Yes. There was a clutch of us caught the bus together. And then in the 60s, chasing steam engines, we'd disappear at 8 o'clock on a Friday night.
Yes.
And we'd sleep in railway carriages, travel all over the place.
What?
The tales, you wouldn't call it hooliganism, but my God, it was an expansive way of life.
It was pleasantly feral. It was pleasantly feral, and you weren't imposing your you weren't polluting anybody else's existence. You were just roaming free.
Exactly. Sleeping the night in a goods van in Heysham Goods Yard.
What was that about? You've lost me a bit there. Why were you sleeping in a goods van in a goods yard?
The very last steam express on British Railways went to Heysham on a Saturday night.
Right. It wasn't compulsory to be on it, Frank. What was the appeal?
I wasn't going to miss doing 85 mile an hour behind a Black 5 up the West Coast main line.
Oh, and the only way you could do that was to follow it all the way back to the yard and then sleep there because you wouldn't be able to get home otherwise.
And then at 6 o'clock in the morning, back we came to Manchester behind the same steam locos. And the friendships we made back in the 60s, those of us who are still around, were still there.
Just forgive me for being stupid. What do you mean behind? I mean, you were on the train. You were in a carriage on the train. When you say behind it, you mean behind the engine. You weren't sort of skateboarding off the back of it or anything like that.
Oh, no.
No, sorry. You said lingo. I didn't follow the lingo. Yeah.
Heads out the window, getting cinders in your hair.
This is fantastic. I can almost smell them. I was on the Severn Valley Railway
living the experience, and is that what modern kids are missing?
I don't know. Where do you think the paranoia kicked in then, looking back over the last 50 years? Where do you think it came from? Because parents now, hearing what you describe, will be having a fit of the vapours.
I really do not understand it, James.
No.
You know, I mean, my grandkids, one of them is trying to get out to sea as a Marine officer.
Right.
He takes it for granted that he'll jump on a plane in Manchester and fly to Aberdeen to join his ship.
Yes.
He's not 18 yet. My other grandson is playing rugby for fun, and I must admit, I dug a photograph of myself out on Sunday, having gone to the local agricultural show.
Oh, yes.
Of me at the age of 7 with a young cow on a rope, and there was my grandson looking back at me. I thought, dear God.
Well, I hope he stops looking like a cow soon, Frank. Also, I can't believe you just embarrassed him like that on the radio. The poor lad.
I know who he is, you don't.
I know. I love that. And I love that story. It's a wonderful example because I guess the further back you go, the more extreme these examples become. So for me, it would be just getting on my bicycle with some sandwiches in my knapsack and cycling off for the whole day and not coming back until tea time. And children would not do that now. Some would, but the world is not a more dangerous place. It just isn't than when Frank was growing up or when I was growing up. And yet we are convinced that it is. And that's why I think this is such an engaging story that Kirstie Allsopp has inadvertently ignited, because everybody deep down knows that she's right. Even the people insisting that she's wrong, deep down they know that she's right. And they're envious of her for one of two reasons. Either because they envy her sang-froid, they envy her immunity to the paranoia, to the persistent perennial parental paranoia, or they envy the fact that she somehow managed to raise a 15-year-old who she knows would be capable of making this trip in the first place. And that's the end of my TED Talk.
James O'Brien on LBC.
47 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. So there is a bunch of factors at play here. And Eleanor's just reminded me of the extraordinary traction that the case of Jay Slater got as well. Older than some of the people that we're talking about today. But that fear of the unknowable that so many parents recognise, and which we all know is a relatively modern phenomenon, poor Jay Slater encapsulated in many ways. And then when the circumstances of his passing became clear, it kind of added to that sense of constant peril, constant threat. It's not even the stuff that you'd think it would be. Like mentioning that I'd be more likely to let a son go. I don't have a son than a daughter. And Helen says, why? In many ways, a group of girls would be much more sensible and rational than a group of boys. They'd stick together. They'd look out for one another more than a group of 15-year-old boys might. And she's absolutely right. But I suppose you're more worried about sexual assault with daughters than you are with sons. But again, a group of 15-year-old girls together is probably going to be at least as safe as a group of 15-year-old boys together, if not more so. But so what is it that you're worried about? What is it that I'm worried about? And then you focus on the Jay Slater story and you're worried about them falling in a river or falling off a bridge. You're just constantly bloody worried about, and it can't be good for you. But when you also read about GCSE exam anxiety being rife among exactly the age group of Kirstie Allsopp's son, you realise that it's not good for them either. And they must be, like a form of emotional osmosis, they must be picking up on the anxious way that you approach the world and translating it into their own anxieties. Lucy is in Hammersmith. Lucy, what would you like to say?
Hi.
Hello,
so
Lucy.
I'm 16 and I've just gotten back from 3 weeks in Nepal, which I did myself.
Nepal?
Yeah.
I thought you said the pool. I thought, what are you ringing me to tell me you spent 3 weeks in a swimming pool for? That's not very exciting. So 3 weeks in Nepal and you went off your own back, as it were.
Yep, I went all by myself and I didn't really know, and I didn't know a single person until I got out there.
Wow.
Yeah, and I just sat my GCSEs. I went to Nepal 3 days after my 16th. So,
what did you do when you got there?
So I worked with children in impoverished schools.
Gosh.
So a lot of community work.
So some schools organise trips like this. You organised it as an individual. You found an organisation, a charity that does it, and just signed up with them.
Yeah, that's what I did.
What did Mum and Dad or what did your carers say when you told them the plan?
It was their idea. They said, "We found this, and we think you should go."
And what did you say?
I loved the idea. I just thought, because so many of my friends, their parents keep them on such a short tether,
yes,
they can't do anything. So I just thought it was an amazing opportunity, and I really enjoyed it because I grew up in Wales, in the countryside, and I was 13 when I moved up to London.
Yes.
And immediately my parents, they let me go on the tube and just take myself around the city.
And that made you stand out a bit from your peers who'd grown up in London?
Yeah, massively, because so many of my friends, like, their parents won't let them on public transport without them.
Gosh.
And I think it's so important for children to be able to actually go around.
You're exactly right. I mean, I know that you're right, and yet I don't know. I mean, doing it, especially, I suppose you were part of an organisation, weren't you? It's not as if you arrived in Nepal with your backpack on and then just sort of struck out into the street and decided to see where events took you. But you're absolutely right that many parents would balk at it, and many 16-year-olds would be incapable of contemplating it.
Exactly, but because my parents gave me the freedom to be able to go around London and use my phone and use like apps like City Mapper to get around, I got skills which are actually going to help me, because some of my friends, they turn 18, they're going to go to university, they're not going to have a clue what to do.
Yeah, you're not wrong. And how was the experience? What was the actual experience like working in the country, working with the children?
Oh, it was absolutely incredible. I would do it 100 times again. It was just learning about a completely different culture and working with kids who are in a third world country and are in massive poverty. It was really inspiring to just kind of see the way of life over there.
Right. Well, I mean, everybody listening will be both admiring of your coolness, but also, as I've said throughout, acknowledging the fact that every 16-year-old should really sound like you, but the massive majority, as you say, talking about your own friends, the massive majority don't. Thank you, Lucy, and good luck with your A-levels. 12:53 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm going to read you something which is a little bit of a shame, really, but I think sometimes you may think I'm exaggerating when I tell you that dedicating your entire life to watching social media feeds designed to make you terrified of people of colour, the damage it can do to you. I mean, it helped cause the race riots, but Blake in Wigan is a casualty of precisely what I'm describing. He writes, I was born in 1981. Back then, we never had Muslim child rape gangs, Africans chasing each other down the street with machetes. In fact, we didn't have any Africans living in my town. Acid attacks, honour killings, and female genital mutilation. What a time to be alive, but isn't diversity great? So that is what happens to you when you spend your life immersed in social media feeds designed to make you hate people of colour because some of them are criminals. A position exactly as logical of hating all white people because some of them are criminals, or hating all white people because some of them are Blake in Wigan. So that's what it does to you. And there is someone who would, either in spirit or in person, have been trying to set fire to an asylum seekers hotel last week. It's helpful sometimes when I get these messages because they allow me to illustrate precisely who it is I'm worrying about when I describe these social media accounts I stumble across dedicated to providing or producing precisely the mindset that Blake demonstrates. So he's terrified of everything, and he's a fully grown man. We can hardly be surprised that teenagers are anxious about real threats, let alone the ones but he's imagining. Nicola is in Sutton. Nicola, what would you like to say?
Hi, and just going on from that, travel is one of the things that opens your mind to different cultures and experiences and just develops individuals. I mean, I rang because I went interrailing at the age of 15. I was with my younger sister, who was 14, and a friend who's just a couple of months older, so she had just turned 16.
Because I think if you haven't got a 16-year-old with you, certainly now, I don't know what it was like then, it's quite hard to get into hostels and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, we are talking a little while ago, so I'm 52 now. But, I was just thinking, so that's 30 years, but it has, times have changed. I spent my 16th birthday on a Korčula, a little island off of then the coast of Yugoslavia. I spent my 16th birthday there. It's something I will never forget. We had the most amazing experience. We headed for the sun. That's what we wanted to do. And as you said, we were away we were both from single parent families, right. But we were away from our mums for a month, and it wasn't even 3 weeks. It was a month. It's
extraordinary, really, to think how different that sounds today compared to. I'm exactly the same age as you, compared to how it would have sounded in 1987. Postcards, if you were lucky, if you could be bothered, and no guarantee that they'd even get there. Are you a parent yourself, if you don't mind me asking?
I am, yes. So,
okay, so you know what's coming then.
Yes, so I've got a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old.
Yes.
And they unfortunately hit that kind of age when it was lockdown. So, they had a good few years when there was no option. They wouldn't
That's
have
a really good point, and that's got to have added
that.
to some of these issues as well.
Yeah.
But do you suffer from the paranoia that we've been describing yourself?
So I've got a daughter who wants to travel the world, and I've got a son who doesn't leave his room. So they're very different in that respect.
Yes.
But as soon as we came out of COVID, I sent them both to my sister, who lives in Norway, for a week, and they travelled by themselves. And I did that for exactly that reason. I mean, yes, they were going to family, and they were being picked up at the airport and stuff, so it was quite a safe.
I'm a great believer in the more that you do, the less anxious you become. I mean, I'm not suggesting that this is a cure for clinical depression or anything like that, but, therapists call it aversion therapy, don't they? You do the thing that you're frightened of, and then you become less frightened every time you do it.
Yeah, no, totally. And my issue is that I'm actually very, very easygoing and relaxed. I was brought up in, inner city London. I did a lot of travelling. Me and my sister went to Australia to visit our dad by ourselves on the plane when I was 14. Yeah. When I was 10, me and my friend went to America for, months.
You weren't in a Slipknot video, were you?
Oh, in a what?
In a Slipknot video? No, just checking. That would have been a coincidence.
But what I wanted to say is my husband is very anxious. And, I think that is one of the things that, you were talking about how communication is one of the things that has changed over the last,
the lines of communication being constantly open is actually a curse.
And it's incredibly negative.
Yes, it is. I'd only realised that today.
Hearing bad news stories.
Yes, exactly that. Well, there's two lines of communication. Lines of communication to the bad news stories that allow the poor fella in Wigan to spend his entire life being terrified of brown people, really. And then you've got the constant lines of communication open to the people that you love, which makes you panic when you have a 30-second window. You can't see their icon update on the Find My app or... Holy moly, Nicola, it's a miracle we all get through the day. That's it from me for another one. Apologies to Chris and to Peter, Stephen and others. We'll return to elements of this conversation. A lot of you have enjoyed it as much as I did. Inspirational indeed is one of the words that has been used a few times in my inbox. If you missed any of today's inspirational show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as all of Global's live radio stations. Download Global Player for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Ben Kentish standing in for Tom Swarbrick, who's currently standing in for Nick Ferrari, but now it's Sheila Fogarty.
Yes, the needle will keep wagging, as they used to say, and we will keep talking.
James O'Brien on LBC.